Chapter 17 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 17. Fanny Middleton arrives in New York. 3 weeks after Mr. Middleton's departure for New Orleans, Mr. Miller's school closed. Uncle Joshua was present at the examination, and congratulated himself much, because he did not feel at all "stuck up" at seeing both Julia and Fanny acquit themselves so creditably. After the exercises were concluded, he returned with Mr. Miller to Mrs. Crane's. Just before he started for home, he drew from his sheepskin pocketbook $500, which he divided equally between his daughters, saying, "Here, gals, I reckon this'll be enough to pay for all the furbelows you've bought or will want to buy. I'll leave you here the rest of the week to see to fixin' up your rig, but Saturday I shall send for you." Fanny was surprised at her father's unlooked-for generosity, and thanked him again and again. Julia was silent, but her face told how vexed and disappointed she was. As soon as her father was gone, her rage burst forth. "Stingy old thing!" said she, "and yet he thinks he's done something wonderful. Why, my bill at C's already amounts to $200, and I want as much more. What I am to do I don't know." She would have said more, but Fanny quieted her by saying, "Don't talk so about father, Julia. It was very liberal, and really I do not know what to do with all mine." But we will not continue this conversation. Suffice it to say that when Julia retired that night, her own money was safe in her purse, and by the side of it lay the $100 she had coaxed from Fanny. As they were preparing to return home on Saturday, Julia said to her sister, "Fan, don't let father know that you gave me $100, for I fear all your powers of persuasion would be no avail to stay the storm he would consider it his bounden duty to raise." There was no need of this caution, for Fanny was not one to do a generous act and then boast of it, neither did her father ask her how she had disposed of her money. He was satisfied to know that the 4 silk gowns were purchased, as in his estimation they constituted the essential part of a young lady's wardrobe. Since Fanny had disclosed the heartless desertion of Dr. Lacey, she seemed to be doubly dear to her father, for pity now mingled with the intense love he always had for his youngest and best loved daughter. Often during the last 3 days she passed at home prior to her departure for New York, he would sit and gaze fondly upon her until the tears would blind his vision, then springing up, he would pace the floor impetuously, muttering, "The scamp! The vagabond! But he'll get his pay fast enough, and I'd pay him too if I hadn't promised not to, but 'tain't worth a while, for I reckon 'twould only make her face grow whiter and thinner if I did anything." At length the morning came on which Julia and Fanny were to leave for the first time their native state. Side by side near the landing at Frankfort lay the 2 boats, Blue Wing and Diana. The one was to bear Fanny on her northern tour, and the other would convey Julia as far as Louisville on her way south. Mr. Woodburn, who had business in New Orleans, was to take Julia under his protection. And now but a short time remained ere the Diana would loose her moorings and be under way. These few moments were moments of sorrow to Mr. and Mrs. Middleton, who had accompanied their daughters to Frankfort. Uncle Joshua particularly was much depressed, and scarce took his eyes from his treasure, who might be leaving him forever. In his estimation, the far-off North was a barren, chilly region, and although he did not quite believe his Fanny would be frozen to death, he could not rid himself of the fear that something would befall her. "You'll take good care of her, won't you, Miller?" said he, "and bring her safely back to us?" Mr. Miller gave the promise, and then observing that there was something else on Mr. Middleton's mind, he said, "What is it, Mr. Middleton? What more do you wish to say?" Mr. Middleton struggled hard with his feelings, and his voice sank to a whisper as he answered, "I wanted to tell you that if she should die, bring her home. Bring her back. Don't leave her there all alone." The old man could say no more, for the bell rang out its last warning. The parting between Fanny and her parents was a sad one, and even Julia wept as she kissed her sister, and thought it might be for the last time. Soon after the Diana, with its precious freight, disappeared from view, Mr. Middleton was called upon to bid another farewell to his eldest daughter. "Reckon the old fellow likes one girl better than the other," said a bystander who had witnessed both partings. And yet Mr. Middleton did well, and his look and manner was very affectionate as he bade Julia good-bye, and charged her "not to be giddy and act like a fool, nor try to come it over Dr. Lacey. Though," thought he, "it'll be sarving the rascal right if he should have to live with Tempest all his life." It is not our intention at present to follow Julia in her passage to New Orleans. In another chapter we will take up the subject and narrate her adventures. Now we prefer going north with the other party, which consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Fanny, and Raymond. The latter had, in a fit of desperation, determined to quit Frankfort, and go no one knew whither. He accompanied his friends as far as Cincinnati, and there bade them adieu, saying that they would hear of him again in a way they little dreamed of. Mr. Miller was sorry to part with one who had proved so valuable an assistant in his school, but all his arguments had failed, and he was obliged to give him up, saying, "I hope, Raymond, that all your laudable enterprises may be successful." "I shall succeed," were Raymond's emphatic words, "and she, the haughty woman, who tried to smile so scornfully when I bade her farewell, will yet be proud to say she has had a smile from me, a poor schoolmaster." "Well, Raymond," said Mr. Miller, "you have my good wishes, and if you ever run for president, I'll vote for you. So now good bye." Raymond wrung his friend's hand, and then stepped from the cars, which soon rolled heavily from the depot. Faster and faster sped the train on its pathway over streamlet and valley, meadow and woodland, until at last the Queen City, with its numerous spires, was left far behind. From the car windows Fanny watched the long blue line of hills, which marks the Kentucky shore, until they too disappeared from view. For a time now we will leave her to the tender mercies of the Ohio Railroad and a Lake Erie steamer, and hurrying on in advance, we will introduce the reader to the home where once had sported Richard Wilmot and his sister Kate. It stood about half a mile from the pleasant rural village of C, in the eastern part of New York. The house was large and handsome, and had about it an air of thrift and neatness, which showed its owner to be a farmer, who not only understood his business, but also attended to it himself. Between the house and the road was a large grassy lawn, on which was growing many a tall, stately maple and elm, under whose wide spreading branches Kate and her brother had often played during the gladsome days of their childhood. A long piazza ran around two sides of the building. Upon this piazza the family sitting room opened. Could we have entered that sitting room the day on which our travelers arrived, we should have seen a fine-looking, middle-aged lady, whose form and features would instantly have convinced us that we looked upon the mother of Kate. Yes, what Kate Miller is now, her mother was once, but time and sorrow have made inroads upon her dazzling beauty, and here and there the once bright locks of auburn are now silvered over, and across the high white brow are drawn many deep-cut lines. Since Kate last saw her mother, these lines have increased, for the bursting heart has swelled with anguish, and the dark eye has wept bitter tears for the son who died far away from his childhood's home. Even now the remembrance of the noble youth who scarce 2 years ago left her full of life and health makes the tear-drops start as she says aloud, "How can I welcome back my darling Kate, and know that he will never come again?" The sound of her voice aroused old Hector, the watchdog, who had been lying in the sun upon the piazza. Stretching his huge limbs and shaking his shaggy sides, he stalked into the sitting room, and going up to his mistress, laid his head caressingly in her lap. The sight of Hector made Mrs. Wilmot's tears flow afresh, for during many years he had been the faithful companion of Richard, whose long absence he seemed seriously to mourn. For days and weeks he had watched by the gate, through which he had seen his young master pass, and when at last the darkness of night forbade a longer watch, he would lay his head on the ground and give vent to his evident disappointment in a low, mournful howl. Mrs. Wilmot was not superstitious, but when, day after day, the same sad cry was repeated, it became to her an omen of coming evil, and thus the shock of her son's death, though none the less painful, was not quite as great as it would otherwise have been. For Kate, too, old Hector had wept, but not so long or so mournfully. Still he remembered her, and always evinced his joy whenever her name was spoken. On the morning of the day on which she was expected home, a boy who had lived in the family when she went away, called Hector to him, and endeavored, by showing him some garment which Kate had worn, and by repeating her name, to make him understand that she was coming home. We will not say that Hector understood him, but we know that during the day he never for a moment left the house or yard, but lay upon the piazza, looking eagerly toward the road which led from the village. Whenever he saw a carriage coming, he would start up and gaze wistfully at it until it had passed, then he would again lie down and resume his watch. Mrs. Wilmot noticed this, and when Hector, as we have seen, walked up to her and looked so sympathizingly in her face, she patted his head, saying, "Poor Hector, you will see Kate at least to-day." Nor was she mistaken, for about 3 that afternoon an omnibus drew up before the gate. Kate immediately sprang out, and was followed by Mr. Miller and Fanny. Their arrival was first made known to Mrs. Wilmot by the cry of joy which Hector sent forth at sight of Kate. With lightning speed he bounded over the lawn to meet the travelers. Fanny, who was accustomed to the savage watchdogs of Kentucky, sprang back in terror and clung to Mr. Miller for protection. But Kate cried out, "Do not fear, it is only Hector, and he wouldn't harm you for the world." Then she ran forward to meet him, and embraced him as fondly as though he had really been a human being, and understood and appreciated it all. And he did seem to, for after caressing Kate, he looked about as if in quest of the missing one. Gradually he seemed to become convinced that Richard was not there. Again was heard the old wailing howl, but this time it was more prolonged, more despairing. Faithful creature! Know you not that summer's gentle gale and winter's howling storm have swept over the grave of him whom you so piteously bemoan? Fanny stopped her ears to shut out the bitter cry, but if Kate heard it, she heeded it not, and bounded on over the gravelled walk toward her mother, who was eagerly waiting for her. In an instant parent and child were weeping in each other's arms. "My Kate! My darling Kate! Are you indeed here?" said Mrs. Wilmot. Kate's only answer was a still more passionate embrace. Then recollecting herself, she took her husband's hand and presented him to her mother, saying, "Mother, I could not bring you Richard, but I have brought you another son. Will you not give him room in your heart?" Mrs. Wilmot had never seen Mr. Miller before, but she was prepared to like him, not only because he was her daughter's choice, but because he had been the devoted friend of her son. Consequently she greeted him with a most kind and affectionate welcome. During all this time Fanny was leaning against one of the pillars of the piazza, but her thoughts were far away. She was thinking of her distant Kentucky home, and a half feeling of homesickness crept over her, as she thought how joyfully she would be greeted there should she ever return. Her reverie was of short duration, for Kate approached, and leading her to her mother, simply said, "Mother, this is Fanny." 'Twas enough. The word Fanny had a power to open the fountains of that mother's heart. She had heard the story of the young girl, who had watched so unweariedly by the bedside of Richard. She had heard, too, of the generous old man, whose noble heart had cared for and cherished the stranger, and she knew that she, who advanced toward her so timidly, was the same young girl, the same old man's daughter, and could Mr. Middleton have witnessed her reception of his sunshine, he would have been satisfied. A messenger was dispatched for Mr. Wilmot, who was superintending some workmen in a field not far from the house. Mr. Wilmot was a tall, noble-looking man, whose fine figure was slightly bowed by the frosts of 60 winters. As he advanced with breathless haste toward the house, Kate ran to meet him, and the tears which the strong man wept told how dear to him was this, his beautiful daughter, and how forcibly her presence reminded him of his first-born, only son, who went away to die among strangers. When he was presented to Mr. Miller and Fanny, a scene similar to the one we have already described took place. As he blessed Fanny for Richard's sake, she felt that though in a strange land she was not alone or unloved. Her homesickness soon vanished, for how could she be lonely and sad, where all were so kind, and where each seemed to vie with the other in trying to make everything agreeable to her? It was strange how soon even Hector learned to love the fair Kentuckian. He would follow her footsteps wherever she went, and affectionately kiss her hands. But then, as Kate said, Hector had more common sense than half the people in the world, and he seemed to know by instinct that she whom he so fondly caressed had once watched over his young master, who was now sleeping in his silent grave, unmindful that in his home he was still sincerely mourned even by old Hector. Not many days after Fanny's arrival at Mr. Wilmot's, she was told that a gentleman wished to see her in the parlor. On entering the room, how surprised she was at beholding Frank Cameron. He had learned by letter from Kate that Fanny was in C, and he immediately started for his uncle's. Since his return from Kentucky he had thought of little else save Fanny Middleton. Waking or sleeping, she was constantly in his mind, and still with a happy thought of her, there ever came a sadder feeling, a fear that his love for her would be in vain. But since the morning when he bade her adieu, her name had never once passed his lips. When his sister Gertrude questioned him concerning the Kentucky girls, he had described to her in glowing terms the extreme beauty of Julia, and the handsome eyes of the "widder," as he called Mrs. Carrington. But of Fanny he had never spoken. He could not bear that even his own sister should mention Fanny in connection with anyone else. However, when Kate's letter arrived, he passed it over to Gertrude, whose curiosity was instantly roused, and she poured forth a torrent of questions as to who that Fanny Middleton was. "I suppose she must be old Mr. Middleton's daughter," was Frank's teasing reply. "Of course I know that," said Gertrude. "But what of her? Who is she?" "Why, I've told you once. She is Fanny Middleton," said Frank. These and similar answers were all Gertrude could draw from him, and she fell into a fit of pouting, but Frank was accustomed to that, and consequently did not mind it. Next he announced his intention to visit his uncle Wilmot. Gertrude instantly exclaimed, "Now, Frank, you are too bad. Just as soon as you hear Fanny Middleton is in New York, you start off to see her, without even telling me who she is, or what she is. In my opinion, you are in love with her, and do not wish us to know it." This started up Mrs. Cameron's ideas, and she said, "Frank, I am inclined to believe Gertrude is right, but you surely will be respectful enough to me to answer my questions civilly." "Certainly," said Frank. "Ask anything you please. Only be quick, for it is almost car time." "Well, then, do you intend to make this Miss Middleton your wife?" "I do, if she will have me," said Frank. The distressed lady groaned audibly, but continued, "One more question, Frank. Is she rich and well connected?" Frank passed his hand through the thick curls of his brown hair, and seemed to be trying hard to think of something. Finally he answered, "Why, really, mother, I never once thought to ask that question." "But," persisted Mrs. Cameron, "you can judge by her appearance, and that of her parents. Did you not see them?" Frank laughed loudly as the image of Uncle Joshua as he first saw him in the door, buttoning his suspender, presented itself to his remembrance. But he answered, "Yes, mother, I did see her father, and 'twas the richest sight I ever saw." He then proceeded to give a description of Mr. Middleton to his astonished sister and mother, the latter of whom exhibited such distress that Frank very compassionately asked if she had the toothache. Before she had time to answer, Frank was gone, leaving his mother to lament over the strange infatuation which always led Frank in pursuit of somebody beneath him. "I know," said she to Gertrude, "that this Fanny Middleton is from a horrid low family, and is as poor as a church mouse." So while Frank was hurrying toward the village of C., his mother and sister were brooding over the disgrace which they feared threatened them. They could have spared all their painful feelings, for she of the low family was destined to be another's. During Frank's ride to C., he determined, ere his return, to know the worst. "She can but refuse me," thought he, "and even if she does, I shall feel better than I do now." When he met Fanny, his manner was so calm and collected that she never dreamed how deep was the affection she had kindled in his heart. She received him with real pleasure, for he seemed like a friend from Kentucky. He stayed with her but 3 days, and when he left he bore a sadder heart than he had ever felt before. Fanny had refused him, not exultingly, as if a fresh laurel had been won only to be boasted of, but so kindly, so delicately, that Frank felt almost willing to act it all over again for the sake of once more hearing Fanny's voice, as she told him how utterly impossible it was for her ever again to love as a husband should be loved. "Then," said Frank, somewhat bitterly, "you acknowledge that you have loved another." "Yes," answered Fanny, "but no other circumstances could have wrung the confession from me. I have loved and been deceived. I will not say my faith in man's honor is wholly gone, for I believe you, Mr. Cameron, to be perfectly sincere and honorable in your professions of regard. Had we met earlier all might have been different, but now it is too late. If my friendship is worth having, it is yours. I have never had a brother, but will look upon and love you as one. With that you must be satisfied." And he did try to be satisfied, but only because there was no other alternative. Still he felt a pleasure in being near her, in breathing the same atmosphere, in gazing on the same scenes. Before he returned home, he had decided upon accompanying her, together with Mr. and Mrs. Miller, on their contemplated trip to Saratoga. Thence they would go on to New York City and visit at his father's. "I am sorry," said he, "that it is not the season for parties, as I should love dearly to show off Fanny in opposition to our practised city belles. And now I think of it," continued he, "isn't Mr. Stanton coming north this summer after a certain Miss Ashton?" "I believe he is," answered Kate. "Now then," said Frank, "I have it exactly. Judge Fulton, who is Miss Ashton's guardian, has recently removed to the city. I knew him well, and have been introduced to Miss Helen. Stanton has already invited us all to his wedding, and as Miss Ashton will of course repeat the invitation, Fanny will thus have an opportunity of seeing a little of the gay world in New York." "You seem to think any praise bestowed upon Fanny is so much credit for yourself," said Kate, mischievously. Frank made no reply, and soon bidding good-bye to his friends, he was on his way to the city. On reaching home, he found his mother and sister in a state of great anxiety, concerning "the odious old scarecrow's corn-cake daughter," as Gertrude styled Fanny. Her first question, after asking about Kate, was, "Well, Frank, tell me, did you propose to Miss Middleton?" "Most certainly I did. That was one object in going," was Frank's quiet reply. The horrified Mrs. Cameron, throwing up both hands in a most theatrical manner, exclaimed, "Mon Dieu!" It was the only French phrase she knew, and she used it upon all occasions. This time, however, it was accompanied by a loud call for her vinaigrette and for air, at the same time declaring it was of no use trying to restore her, for her heart was broken, and she was going to faint. "Let me wash these red spots off from your cheek. You can't faint gracefully with so much color," said Frank gravely, at the same time literally deluging his mother's face with cologne, much against the blooming lady's inclination. This little scene determined Frank not to tell that he was rejected. At first he had intended to disclose all, but now he decided otherwise. "They may as well fret about that as anything else," thought he, "and when they see Fanny I shall have a glorious triumph." So he kept his own secret, and commenced teasing Gertrude about going to Saratoga with himself, their cousin Kate, and Fanny. "I shall do no such thing, Master Frank," said Gertrude. "I am willing enough to see Kate, and invite her here too, for she is fine looking and appears well, even if she is a music teacher. But this Fanny Middleton? Ugh! I'll never associate with her on terms of equality, or own her as my sister either." "I do not think you will," said Frank, but Gertrude knew not what cause he had for so saying. After he had quitted the apartment, Mrs. Cameron and Gertrude tried to think of some way to let Fanny know that she was not wanted in their family. "Dear me," said Gertrude, "I will not go to Saratoga, and be obliged to see Frank make a dolt of himself with this plebeian Kentuckian. If she were only rich and accomplished, why it would be different, and the fact of her being from Kentucky would increase her attractions. But now it is too bad." And Gertrude actually cried with vexation and mortified pride. Poor creature! How mistaken she was with regard to Fanny Middleton, and so she one day learned. But as the reader is doubtless anxious to hear of Fanny's introduction to Mrs. Cameron and Gertrude, we will give a description of it in the next chapter. End of chapter 17. Recording by Amanda Friday. Chapter 18 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 18. Fanny welcomed by Mrs. Cameron. Contrary to his first intention, Stanton concluded to come north in July. He had of course learned from Nellie that her mysterious guardian had proved to be Judge Fulton, his sister's husband. And more recently she had written to him of Judge Fulton's removal to New York City. Mr. Miller was apprised of Stanton's return by a letter, in which he was also informed that the wedding would take place in Grace Church on the morning of the 22nd. Not long after, there came invitations for himself, wife, and Fanny to attend the bridal party at the residence of Judge Fulton on the evening of July 25. Frank, who was also invited, had his own reason for not wishing his mother or sister to see Fanny until they met her at Judge Fulton's. Consequently, he was not sorry when both ladies graciously informed him that Miss Middleton would not be invited by them to visit at their house. "Of course," said Mrs. Cameron, "we shall invite Kate and her husband, and shall be glad to see them. If you choose, you can in your own name invite Fanny, but if she knows anything she will not come." Frank knew there was no possible danger of Fanny's accepting an invitation, which came simply from himself, but he did not say so, and next day he started again for his uncle Wilmot's. To his cousin Kate he imparted a knowledge of his mother's and Gertrude's feelings, and also told of his own plans. Kate readily fell in with them, and when Frank returned to the city he was accompanied by Mr. Miller, Kate, and Fanny, who took rooms at the Astor House. As soon as Mrs. Cameron and Gertrude learned that Kate was in the city, they called upon her. Fanny they of course did not see, neither did they mention her name. Kate expected as much, but nevertheless felt vexed, and when they urged her to spend the remainder of her time with them, she replied, "I have a young friend from Kentucky with me, and unless you invite her too, I do not feel at liberty to accept your polite invitation." In answer to this, Gertrude muttered something about not wishing to enlarge the circle of her acquaintance, while Mrs. Cameron said nothing, and the two ladies soon swept haughtily out of the room. "Never mind," said Frank, to whom Kate related her adventure. "They will both sing another tune ere long." And he was right, too. The 25th of July at last arrived. Frank had informed Gertrude that she must look to her father for a beau that evening, as he should be otherwise engaged, so she was not surprised when her brother, long before sunset, left the house all equipped for the party. She well knew where he was going, and for whose society she was deserted. 1 hour later found her seated in a large armchair before the mirror in her dressing-room. Gertrude was a tall, fine-looking girl, but in the expression of her handsome features there was something wanting. She lacked soul, and no one ever looked on the cold, proud face of Gertrude Cameron without being convinced that she was altogether heartless and selfish. On this occasion, as she sat in the large armchair, she said to her waiting maid, "I say, Jane, you must do your best tonight to have me splendidly dressed." "Yes, ma'am, I understand," said Jane, and she proceeded to bedeck her young mistress with all sorts of finery. Her dress consisted of a rich white satin, over which was thrown a skirt of handsomely embroidered lace. All the ornaments of gold and diamonds, for which a place could possibly be found, were heaped upon her, and when her toilet was completed, she seemed one gorgeous mass of jewelry. "There, that will do," said she, as Jane clasped the last diamond bracelet on her arm. "I presume this Fanny Middleton has never dreamed of so costly a dress as I shall appear in tonight." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, another toilet was being made, but of a different nature. Kate and Frank both were anxious that for once Fanny should deviate from her usually simple style of dress, and adopt something more in keeping with her father's wealth. At first Fanny hesitated, but was finally persuaded, and gave Kate permission to select for her anything she chose. As, on the evening of the party, she glanced at the image which her mirror reflected, she was pardonable for feeling a slight thrill of pleasure. Frank was in raptures, declaring nothing had ever been seen in New York so perfectly lovely. And truly Fanny was beautiful as she stood there arrayed for the party. She was dressed in a French robe of white tarlatan, embroidered in bouquets of lilies of the valley in silver. A single japonica rested among the curls of her bright hair, while her neck was encircled by a necklace of pearls, and costly bracelets of the same clasped her white, slender wrists. "Why, Fanny," said Mr. Miller, "how beautiful you look! What would your father say could he see you now?" At the mention of her father's name, the teardrops glistened for a moment in Fanny's eye, and she felt how gladly she would have foregone all the expected pleasure of that night for the pleasure of again seeing her distant father. She, however, dashed the tears away, and replied, "I fear he would think his sunshine wholly covered up and spoiled by trumpery, as he calls fashionable dress." Frank noticed her emotion when speaking of her father, and he thought how priceless must be the love of one who thus so truly honored her parents. A feeling of sadness was blended with his admiration of Fanny, for constantly in his heart was the knowledge that she never would be his. And here Frank showed how truly noble he was, for he could still love and cling to Fanny, although he knew that for him there was no hope. Let us now transport our readers to the elegant residence of Judge Fulton, which was situated upon Fifth Avenue. Stanton, with his fair bride, had returned from visiting his parents near Geneva, and now in the large parlors of Judge Fulton they were receiving the congratulations of their friends, whose numbers each moment increased, until the rooms were filled to overflowing. Frank and his party had not yet arrived. He designed to be late, for he well knew his mother and sister would not be early, and he wished to give them the full benefit of Fanny's introduction into the drawing-room. But a part of his scheme was frustrated, for his mother, who was suffering with a violent headache, was obliged to remain above stairs for a time, and Gertrude alone witnessed her brother's triumph. She was standing near Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, carelessly twirling a costly bouquet, which one of her obsequious beaux had given her, when she overheard Nellie say to her husband, "I do hope she will come, for I am all impatience to see one whom you have praised until I am half jealous." Gertrude wondered much whom Mrs. Stanton could mean, but her wonder soon ceased, for there was a stir at the door. The crowd around it fell back as Frank Cameron walked proudly into the room, bearing upon his arm Fanny Middleton. Her fame had preceded her, for many of those present had learned that a Kentucky belle and heiress was stopping at the Astor, and would be present at the party. As she advanced into the room, Gertrude felt, rather than heard, the murmur of admiration which ran round the room, and her quick ear caught the words, "Yes, that's she. That's the heiress. That's Miss Middleton from Frankfort." Gladly would Gertrude have escaped her brother's eye, which instantly sought her out, but she felt unable to move, and stood watching the animated face and graceful manners of Fanny, who, in being presented to Mrs. Fulton and Stanton, passed near her. Every article of Fanny's dress was noted, and an estimate made as to its probable cost. "She must be wealthy," thought she, "or she could not dress so expensively." Suddenly one of Gertrude's acquaintances touched her elbow and said, "Come, Miss Gertrude, do gratify our curiosity and tell us about this Kentucky belle. Of course you know her, as she is attended by your brother." Deeply mortified, Gertrude was obliged to confess that she had no acquaintance with her. "That's strange," said the lady. "We all supposed she stopped at your father's with your cousin." A new idea entered Gertrude's mind, and instead of replying to this last remark, she said, "I shall know her well, though, for Frank has proposed to her." "Did she accept him?" asked the lady eagerly. "Of course," was Gertrude's haughty answer. "Do you think he would offer himself unless sure of success?" 10 minutes more and dozens of persons were gossiping about the engagement between Frank Cameron and the beautiful Kentuckian. Scores of questions were poured in upon Gertrude relative to her future sister-in-law, but none of them could she answer. Vexed at her own ignorance, she ran upstairs to her mother, whom she told to "come down immediately and see what fools they had made of themselves." "Why, what is the matter, child?" said Mrs. Cameron, much alarmed at Gertrude's excited looks and manners. "All the city is ready to fall down and worship this Fanny Middleton, whom we've treated with such neglect," said Gertrude. And then she added what was of more consequence than all the rest. "Why, mother, she's the most elegantly dressed lady in the room." In a moment Mrs. Cameron was descending the broad staircase. There was the sound of the piano and some one singing. Gertrude pressed forward until she caught sight of the singer, then pulling her mother's sleeve, she whispered, "This way, mother. That is Miss Middleton playing." Mrs. Cameron's first emotion, on beholding Fanny and the flattering attention she everywhere received, was one of intense mortification, to think she had not been first to notice and chaperon her. "I will, however, make all possible amends now," thought she, and finding Frank she desired for herself and Gertrude an introduction to Miss Middleton. But Frank did not feel disposed to grant his mother's request immediately, and he said, "Pardon me, mother, but you see Miss Middleton is very much engaged at present with some of her friends, so you must wait a while." Mrs. Cameron was too proud to ask any one else to introduce her, and it seemed that she and Gertrude were not likely to make Fanny's acquaintance at all. Toward the close of the party, however, Frank thought proper to introduce them. Mrs. Cameron determined to do her best, and she overwhelmed Fanny with so much flattery that the poor girl longed for some way of escape, thinking to herself, "Is it possible that Frank Cameron's mother is such a silly woman?" Once Mrs. Cameron went so far as to hint the probability that Miss Middleton would one day be her daughter. "What can she possibly mean?" thought Fanny. At the same time gracefully excusing herself, she ran upstairs after her shawl and veil, as Kate had signified her intention of returning home. But Mrs. Cameron was not to be thus foiled. She started in pursuit, and reaching the bonnet room as soon as Fanny, insisted that she and Kate should stop with her during the remainder of her stay in the city. As Frank soon appeared, and joined his entreaties with those of his mother, Fanny said she would do just as Mrs. Miller thought proper. Kate, who had expected a similar denouement, expressed her perfect willingness to visit at her uncle's. Accordingly, the next morning they left their rooms at the Astor House, and repaired to Mrs. Cameron's, where they were most affectionately received by Mrs. Cameron and Gertrude. And now commenced a series of toadyism which was vastly amusing to their acquaintances, many of whom had witnessed Mrs. Cameron's manner at the party, and had since learned a part of the story. It was strange how soon Mrs. Cameron and Gertrude discovered how many fine qualities Fanny possessed. Even the odious scarecrow of a father was transformed into an odd old gentleman, and in speaking of him to one of her acquaintances, Mrs. Cameron said, "He was a very generous, wealthy, but eccentric old man, and was one of the first citizens in Frankfort." The good lady forgot that Uncle Joshua did not reside in Frankfort, but 12 miles from that city. Her word, however, was not questioned, for of course she would know all about the family of her son's intended wife. Meanwhile, the report of Frank's engagement was circulated freely, and the whole matter would undoubtedly have been arranged, marriage ceremony and all, had not Frank put an end to the matter by utterly denying the story. Some young gentlemen were one morning congratulating him on his future prospects, and declaring their intention of going to Kentucky, if there were any more Fannys there, when Frank asked upon whose authority they were repeating a story for which there was no foundation. "Why," answered one of them, "my sister heard it from your sister Gertrude." "From Gertrude?" said Frank in amazement. "From Gertrude? Well, I cannot answer for what Gertrude says, but I assure you I am not engaged to Miss Middleton, and have never been." This was in the morning, and that evening when Frank entered the sitting room where his mother and sister were, They beset him to know why he had denied his engagement with Fanny. "Because," he said, rather indignantly, "there is no engagement between us." "Oh, Frank," said Gertrude, "you told us so." "I never told you so," answered he, rather warmly. "I told you I had proposed, and I did propose, and was refused." "But why didn't you tell us?" continued Gertrude. "Because you didn't ask me," replied Frank. "You supposed, of course, none could refuse me, so jumped at conclusions and have got yourself into a fine spot." There was no need of telling this, for Mrs. Cameron readily saw it, and went off into a fit of hysterics, while Gertrude burst into tears. "What a strange girl you are!" said Frank. "Once you cried because you thought I was engaged to Fanny, and now you cry because I am not." So saying, he gave a low, mocking whistle, and left his mother and sister to console themselves as best they could. We will not weary the reader by repeating the conversation between Gertrude and her mother. We will only say that Mrs. Cameron decided to go as soon as possible to Saratoga, and when once there, said she, "I will use all my influence with Miss Middleton. Nay, if necessary, I will even beg her to marry Frank, for I know she likes him." Gertrude was delighted with this idea. She had forgotten how determined she once was not to visit Saratoga with Fanny Middleton. Next morning Mrs. Cameron proposed to her guests that as the weather was getting warm, they should start directly for the Springs. The visitors of course could make no objections, and as Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, who were to accompany them, also acquiesced in the plan, 2 days more found our friends at Saratoga, together with crowds more of the fashionable from the north, south, east, and west. On the first day of their arrival, Fanny noticed seated opposite her at the dinner table a dark-eyed, sprightly-looking girl, whose eyes so constantly met hers that at last both blushed and the stranger girl half smiled. By her side sat a gentleman, whom Fanny concluded was the young lady's brother. Something in their appearance interested Fanny, and she could not help thinking that they were from the South. That evening, as she was walking alone upon the piazza, she was suddenly joined by the unknown lady, who accosted her with, "Pardon me, ma'am, but am I not speaking to Miss Middleton from Kentucky?" Fanny was too much surprised to answer immediately, but soon recovering her self-possession, she answered, "You are, but I have not the pleasure of knowing you." "I presume not," said the lady. "We have never met before, and yet I knew you instantly." "Knew me? How?" asked Fanny. "From description," replied the lady. "You have been so accurately described to me by our mutual friend, Miss Woodburn, of New Orleans, that I could not mistake you." "Florence Woodburn! New Orleans!" exclaimed Fanny. "And are you from New Orleans? And do you know Florence? And have you seen Julia?" To all these questions the stranger answered yes, continuing, "And now let me introduce myself. I am Lida Gibson, but I might as well be John Smith for any idea my name will convey. However, I am from New Orleans, and know Florence and your Uncle William well. Just before I left the city, I made your sister's acquaintance. When she learned I was coming this way, she said I might possibly see you, and made me the bearer of many messages of love." Fanny had never heard of Lida Gibson, but it was sufficient that she knew her uncle and Julia, so her hand was immediately offered, and the remainder of the evening the two young girls promenaded the piazza arm in arm, talking of their distant homes and absent friends. "Where did you see Julia?" asked Fanny. "Your uncle's house was not quite ready, consequently he and Julia were spending a few days at the residence of Dr. Lacey," answered Lida. "Dr. Lacey?" said Fanny, in some surprise. "Julia at Dr. Lacey's?" "Yes, why not?" said Lida, laughing merrily at Fanny's manner. "There is nothing improper about that, for Dr. Lacey's father was then absent, and his mother for the time stayed with her son. I fancied it was not at all unpleasant either to Dr. Lacey or Julia that they were thus thrown together, and I should not wonder if the doctor should one day call you sister." Lida Gibson, whom our readers will recollect as having met at Mabel Mortimer's party in New Orleans, was a thoughtless but kind-hearted girl, and never felt happier than when employed in canvassing matches. On the morning when the Cameron party arrived at the Springs, she had sent her brother to learn the names of the newcomers. On his return, he mentioned Fanny Middleton as being one of the new arrivals, so 'twas not surprising that Lida should so readily recognize her. As days passed on, Lida too heard of the supposed engagement between Fanny and Frank Cameron, and for once kept silent upon the subject, at least in Fanny's presence. Dearly as she loved to discuss such matters, she felt there was something in the character of her new friend which forbade an approach to anything like jesting about so personal an affair as one's own engagement. She, however, fully believed the report, for everything she saw tended to confirm it, and she was anxious to return home that she might carry the important news to Julia and Dr. Lacey. Poor Fanny! The clouds were gathering darkly about her, but she, all unconscious of the consequence, talked, laughed, rode, and sang with Frank, never thinking that she was thus confirming Lida in a belief which would tend to remove Dr. Lacey farther and farther from her. Could Lida have heard a conversation which one evening took place between Mrs. Cameron and Fanny, different, very different, would have been the report which she carried back. One evening, as Fanny, Lida, and Gertrude were walking upon the piazza, a servant came, saying that Mrs. Cameron desired to see Miss Middleton in her room. Fanny immediately obeyed the summons, and as soon as she was gone, Lida laughingly congratulated Gertrude upon the project of having so pleasant a sister. Gertrude smilingly received Miss Gibson's congratulations, for, thought she, even if Fanny does not marry Frank, Miss Gibson will probably never know it, as she is to leave in a few days. Let us now with Fanny repair to Mrs. Cameron's room, but not like her wondering why she was sent for. We well know why, and consequently are prepared for the look of mingled indignation and astonishment which appeared on Fanny's face when she learned that Mrs. Cameron was pleading the cause of her son. Fanny answered, "Madam, I have always entertained the highest respect for your son, but I must confess it is lessened if it is with his knowledge you are speaking to me." Mrs. Cameron, who had at first intimated that it was Frank's request that she should thus intercede for him, now saw her mistake, and veering about, declared what was indeed true, that Frank was wholly ignorant of the whole. Then followed a long, eloquent speech, in which Mrs. Cameron by turns tried to coax, flatter, importune, or frighten Fanny into a compliance with her wishes, but Fanny could only repeat her first answer. "I cannot, Mrs. Cameron, I cannot marry Frank. I acknowledge that I like him, but only as I would love a brother. Further remonstrance is useless, for I shall never marry him." "And why not?" asked Mrs. Cameron. "Do you love another? Are you engaged to another?" "I cannot answer these questions," said Fanny. "Frank knows my reason, and has my permission to give it to you." Then rising, she added, "I suppose our conference is now ended, and with your leave I will retire." Mrs. Cameron nodded her head in assent, and Fanny immediately left the room. A moment after she quitted the apartment, Gertrude entered, all impatient to know her mother's success. "Baffled, baffled," was Mrs. Cameron's reply to her interrogatories. "I can do nothing with her. She is as stubborn as a mule, and we shall either have to conjure up for some reason why the engagement was broken off, or else run the risk of being well laughed at among our circle in New York." A few days after this, Lida Gibson started for the South, promising Fanny that she would see Julia as soon as possible after her return home. Ere long Mrs. Cameron too was seized with a desire to return to the city. The remainder of the party made no objections, and accordingly Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, Mrs. Cameron, Frank and Gertrude were soon in New York. Soon after their return, Mrs. Cameron said, in speaking of Fanny, that 'twas quite doubtful whether Frank would marry her or not. She was so young, and had too so many suitors in Kentucky, that she probably would soon forget him, and for her part she was pleased to have it so. End of chapter 18. Recording by Amanda Friday. Chapter 19 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 19. Julia announces her engagement to Dr. Lacey. Summer was gone and the bright sunny days of autumn had come. Again in Kate Wilmot's home were tears wept and blessings breathed, as Mr. and Mrs. Wilmot bade farewell to their children, as they affectionately called all three of the individuals who were that morning to start for their home in Kentucky. "God bless you, Kate, my darling Kate," said Mrs. Wilmot, as she fondly kissed her only child. Then turning to Fanny, she said, "And you too, my other daughter. You have my love and earnest prayers for your happiness." Mr. Wilmot could not speak, but his feelings were not less deep, as he embraced his child and shook the hands of Mr. Miller and Fanny. Old Hector, too, shared in the general sorrow, but for some undefinable reason he seemed to cling more closely to Fanny. He would look up in her face and howl as if he knew she was leaving him forever. "Noble Hector," said Fanny, And do you indeed love me so well?" Then kneeling down by him, she drew from her neck a tiny locket, in which was a daguerreotype of herself. To this she attached a blue ribbon, which she fastened around Hector's neck, saying, "I cannot stay with you, Hector, but you shall have my likeness." Afterward, when strangers visited the house and marveled at Hector's unusual neck gear, they were shown the fair, sweet face which looked forth from the golden casing, and were told the story of the young girl, whose presence had been like sunshine in Richard Wilmot's darkened home. Mr. Miller was not willing that Fanny should leave New York without first visiting Niagara Falls. Accordingly, they stopped at the falls, and were there joined by Mr. and Mrs. Stanton and Frank, the latter of whom was desirous of seeing Fanny as long as possible. He accompanied them to Buffalo, and stayed upon the boat which was to bear them away, until the last bell rang out its warning. As he was leaving them, Kate playfully asked if they were taking anything of his with them. "Yes, everything, everything," he answered. Soon the steamer was moving proudly over the blue waters of Lake Erie. On the upper deck our Kentucky friends were waving their handkerchiefs to Frank, who stood upon the wharf as long as one bright-haired girl could be distinguished by the light of the harvest moon, whose rays fell calmly upon the placid waters. In a few days Mr. Middleton again folded to his bosom his sunshine, now more precious than ever, because, as he said, "he'd lain awake a heap o' nights worrying about her. The dogs had howled, the death watches had ticked on the wall, and everything had carried on, t'other side up, ever since she'd been gone. But look, Nancy," he continued to his wife, "she's fatting up right smart. Her journey's done her a heap o' good, and I'm glad I let her go." The blacks now crowded round, delighted to welcome home their young mistress, who had a kind word and some little gift for each. Particularly were Aunt Katy and Aunt Judy pleased with the presents of a tasty lace cap, whose value was greatly increased from the fact that they were bought in New York City. In these simple creatures' estimation, New York and Frankfort were the largest places in the world. "I suppose," said Aunt Katy, "that this New York is mighty nigh 3 times as large as Frankfort." "3 times as large!" repeated Fanny. "Why, yes, Katy, 40 times as large." From that time Aunt Katy looked upon Fanny as one not long for this world. "'Tain't in nature," said she, "that she should stay long. Allus was pert like and for'ard, and now has been riding in the railroad all over the airth, and hain't got lost nuther, besides a sailin' along in the steam engine over the salt water." It was indeed marvelous how much Fanny had seen, and when she came to tell the wonder-stricken negroes of the cataract of Niagara, their amazement knew no bounds. Our friend Bobaway did not fail to ease himself by a round of somersaults, his usual manner of expressing surprise or pleasure. At the same time he whispered to Lucy that "he's mistaken if Miss Fanny wa'n't tellin' him a stretcher this time," for which declaration Lucy rewarded him with a smart box on the ear, saying, "Is you no better manners than to 'cuse white folks of lyin'? Miss Fanny never'd got as well as she is if she's picked up a mess of lies to tell us." Fanny's health was indeed much improved, and for a day or two after her return home she bounded about the house and grounds as lightly and merrily as she had done in childhood. Mr. Middleton noticed the change and was delighted. "I believe she's forgetting that paltry doctor," said he, but he was wrong. The 3rd day after her return she was sitting with her parents, relating to them an account of her journey, when Ike entered the room. He had been sent to the post office, and now came up to Fanny, saying, "Here, I done got this 'ere," at the same time handing her a letter, which she instantly saw was from her sister. Eagerly taking it, she said, "A letter from Julia! I am delighted. It is a long time since I have heard from her." Then quickly breaking the seal, she commenced reading it. Gradually, as she read, there stole over her face a strange expression. It was a look of despair, of hope utterly crushed, but she finished the letter, and then mechanically passing it to her father, she said, "Read it. It concerns us all," and then rising she went to her room, leaving her father to read and swear over Julia's letter at his leisure. That he did so no one will doubt when they learn its contents. The first page contained assurances of love, the second congratulated Fanny upon her engagement with Frank, but chided her for suffering Lida Gibson to be the bearer of the news. "Why did you not write to me yourself?" she said. "That is the way I shall do, and now to prove my words you will see how confiding I am." Then followed the intelligence that Dr. Lacey had the night before offered his heart and hand, and of course had been accepted. "You will not wonder at it," she wrote, "for you know how much I have always loved him. I was, however, greatly surprised when he told me he always preferred me to you, but was prevented from telling me so by my silly engagement with Mr. Wilmot and my supposed affection for him." The letter ended by saying that Dr. Lacey would accompany her home some time during the latter part of October, when their marriage would take place. There was also a P.S., in which Julia wrote, "Do, Fan, use your influence with the old man, and make him fix up the infernal old air castle. I'd as soon be married in the horse barn as there." This, then, was the letter which affected Fanny so, and called all of Uncle Joshua's biggest oaths into use. Mrs. Middleton tried to calm her husband and remind him of his promise not to swear. "I know it," said he. "I know I promised not to swear, and for better than 2 months I hain't swore, but I can't help it now. And yet I expected it. I knowed 'twould be so when I let Tempest go to New Orleans. But he'll run himself into a hornet's nest, and I ain't sure but it's just the punishment for him." "Why, then, do you rave so?" asked Mrs. Middleton. "Because," answered her husband, "when I let Tempest go, I'd no idee Sunshine cared so much for him. If I had, I'd have slung a halter round Tempest's neck and tied her up in the hoss barn she likes so well." The old man was evidently piqued at Julia's thrust at the old house. "Fix up! A heap I'll fix up for her to be married," continued he. "Then you'll give your consent?" said Mrs. Middleton. "Consent? Who's asked any consent?" replied he. "And 'tain't likely they will, nuther. And if I should refuse, Tempest wouldn't mind clambering out of the chimbly to run away, and the doctor has showed himself jest as mean. No, he may have her, and go to the old boy for all of Josh. But what's this about Cameron? I hope 'tis so, but I'm mighty feared it ain't. Sunshine can't love 2 at a time." While Mr. Middleton was thus expending his fury, Fanny was alone in her room, struggling hard to subdue the bitter feelings which were rising in her heart. Until now she had not been aware how much she loved Dr. Lacey. True, she had said it was impossible she could ever marry him, and she had believed she was trying to forget him. But ever in her heart she had, perhaps unconsciously, cherished a half-formed belief that all would yet be well, and when she refused the noble, generous heart which Frank Cameron laid at her feet, it was with a vague hope that Dr. Lacey would yet be hers. But now every hope was gone. "There is nothing left for me," said Fanny, "but woe, woe!" 'Twas fearful, the tide of sorrow which swept over the young girl, but amid the wild storm of passion came the echo of a still, small voice, whispering of one who loves with more than an earthly love, who never proves faithless, never fails. Fanny listened to the spirit's pleadings, and resolved that henceforth she would seek to place her affections where there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. The whirlwind of excitement passed over, leaving no trace to mark its passage, save a fixed calm expression, which a more violent demonstration of feeling would not have done. The week following the receipt of Julia's letter, Mr. Middleton had business which took him to Frankfort. Fanny accompanied him, and remained several days. The morning after her arrival she and Mr. Stanton were walking upon the upper balcony at Mrs. Crane's, when they were joined by Ashton, who had returned from New Orleans a few days before. He had always been a frequent visitor there, but since his return, his visits had been more frequent and of longer duration. There was to him something very fascinating about Stanton's fair bride, and yet he always felt uneasy when with her, for her manners and appearance reminded him of the past. This morning, however, the mystery was explained, but in what way he could not tell. Soon after he appeared on the balcony, Nellie pointed to a gentleman who was crossing the street and inquired his name. On being told, she replied, "He looks very much like a Mr. Bernard I used to know years ago in—" mentioning the town where she was born. "Used to know where?" asked Ashton quickly. Nellie repeated the name, and Ashton said, "Why, that's my native town, and I knew Mr. Bernard well." Then, as if the light of a sudden revelation fell upon him, he added, "And your name, too, was Nellie Ashton? I once had a sister, Nellie, on whose rosy cheeks I dropped a tear the night I ran away to sea. Can it be that you are that Nellie?" A few moments more sufficed them to discover what we had long surmised, viz., that Henry Ashton and Nellie Stanton were brother and sister. The surprise and pleasure of their recognition is better imagined than described. We will only say, that when Stanton, on his return from the office, stepped out upon the balcony in quest of his wife, he was greatly shocked at beholding her in Ashton's arms, and his amazement was increased when he saw that she not only suffered his caresses, but also returned them in a manner highly displeasing to the young husband. Fanny, however, soon explained all, and Stanton gladly received Ashton as a newly found brother. It is unnecessary for us to repeat what Nellie and her brother had to relate concerning themselves since the night when Ashton so unceremoniously took leave of his home. With the important points in their history the reader is already acquainted, so for the present we leave them, while we take a brief glance at Mrs. Carrington. The reader will doubtless think that for once in her life that estimable lady has done a good deed, although her motive was not the best in the world. Before Julia went to New Orleans, Mrs. Carrington so far overcame her dislike as to ask her to write. Julia did not promise to do so, but probably concluded she would, for soon after her arrival in New Orleans she wrote to her a letter, in which she hinted at the probable result of her visit. She was then a guest of Dr. Lacey, and she spoke of his attention and politeness in the most extravagant terms. This so provoked Mrs. Carrington that she determined at once to write to Dr. Lacey and give him an insight into Julia's real character. The letter was accordingly written. We must do Mrs. Carrington the justice to say that though her object in writing was purely selfish, she asserted nothing in her letter but what she knew to be strictly true. She was ignorant of Julia's conduct concerning Fanny, consequently she said nothing upon that head, but she spoke of her generally deceitful character, and mentioned several instances in which she had not hesitated to stoop to the basest falsehood for the accomplishment of her purpose. As she was folding the letter, it occurred to her that by some accident Julia might possibly get hold of it. "And then," thought she will recognize my handwriting, and curiosity will impel her to open the letter, after which she wouldn't hesitate a moment to destroy it." The next moment Mrs. Carrington was rapping at the door of Mrs. Miller's room. Kate opened it and was greatly surprised at beholding her visitor, who seldom came there. Mrs. Carrington, however, smilingly presented her letter to Mr. Miller, saying that she had business with Dr. Lacey, which rendered it necessary for her to write to him, and as she did not care to have the post office clerks gossip about her writing to a gentleman, she wished him to direct it for her. Mr. Miller complied with her request, and the next morning the important document was on its way to New Orleans. As our readers have twice made the voyage of the Mississippi, they will not refuse again to run the risk of its floating snags, sandbars, and boat races. So stepping on board the same steamer which bears Mrs. Carrington's letter, we will once more visit Louisiana, and stopping with Dr. Lacey, will see how much of Julia's letter to her sister was true. End of chapter 19. Recording by Amanda Friday. Chapter 20. Of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 20. Rondeau digs up the missing letter. The first 3 weeks of Julia's stay in New Orleans were, as we have learned, spent at the house of Dr. Lacey. His mother was present, and although she readily acknowledged the uncommon beauty of her fair visitor, yet from the first she disliked her. The servants, too, as if adopting the opinion of their mistress, felt and expressed among themselves an aversion to the evil-eyed lady, as they termed Julia. Aunt Dilsey, in particular, soon had her own reason for disliking her. The second day after Julia's arrival, as she was strolling through the yard, she encountered Jackson, a bright little fellow, 3 years of age, and Aunt Dilsey's only son. Jack, as he was usually called, was amusing himself by seeing how far he could spit. Unfortunately, he spit too far, and hit Miss Julia's pink muslin. In an instant her white, slender fingers were buried in his wool. His screams soon brought Aunt Dilsey to the rescue. Upon learning the dreadful crime of which Jack had been guilty, she snatched him from Julia's grasp, and hurried him into the house without a word. From that time Dilsey was Julia's sworn enemy, and Jack was taught to make up faces at her whenever he could do so without being discovered. The servants, however, were too well trained to manifest any open disrespect, for they knew she was "marster's guest," and as such was entitled to every possible attention. When first she arrived, Dr. Lacey felt exceedingly uncomfortable, for her presence constantly reminded him of the past, and his reminiscences of Julia were not particularly pleasant. Gradually this feeling wore away, for she appeared greatly changed. There was a softness, a gentleness in her manner, which seemed to Dr. Lacey like Fanny, and then her voice too was so like her sister's, that ere long she ceased to be disagreeable to him, and instead of avoiding her society, as at first he had done, he now sought it. Julia saw her advantage, and determined to follow it up. Nothing could exceed her extreme amiability and apparent sweetness of disposition. Even Mrs. Lacey was partially deceived, and concluded she had been too hasty in her estimation of Miss Middleton. Still she watched her son's movements narrowly, and hoped he had no intentions of making Julia his wife. She was in New Orleans 3 weeks before her uncle's house was in readiness, but at the end of that time she, together with Dr. Lacey, Mabel Mortimer, and Florence Woodburn, were about to exchange the heat and dust of the city for a cooler residence near the lake. The day before they left was hot and sultry, and in the morning Julia sought the shade of a large vine-wreathed summer house, which stood in the garden, near by the tree under which Rondeau had buried his master's letter. One word now about our old friend Rondeau. The buried letter had cost him a world of trouble. He was constantly fearful lest he should be detected. Particularly was he afraid that the author of the letter, failing to receive an answer, would write again, and thus he might be exposed. Twice had he dug up the epistle upon occasions when he fancied some one of his master's letters bore a similar superscription. In this way he had become tolerably familiar with Mr. Miller's handwriting, which was rather peculiar, being a large, heavy, black hand. On the morning when Julia was snugly ensconced in the summer house, Rondeau returned from the post office in great tribulation. "What's up now?" asked Leffie, whom Rondeau drew aside with a dolefully grave face. "Nothing's up," answered Rondeau. "But the letter has got to come up. I ain't going to feel like I was a whip dog any longer. I'll confess all to Marster George, for see here's another like the buried one." So saying, he held up Mrs. Carrington's letter, on the envelope of which was Mr. Miller's writing. Leffie offered no remonstrance, and as Aunt Dilsey just then screamed for her, Rondeau went alone to the garden, and proceeded to disinter the buried document. 'Twas but the work of a moment, and could Julia have been cooling herself in Greenland, as she ought to have been, all would have ended well. And now I suppose some indignant reader will say, "Why didn't you put her in Greenland then, or some worse place?" But patience, patience, a little longer. You would have us tell things just as they were, I suppose, so we must not only suffer Miss Julia to be in the summer house, but we must also allow her to be a spectator of Rondeau's proceedings. She was greatly surprised when she saw him take from the cigar box a much soiled, yellowish-looking letter, and she could not help feeling that in some way it concerned herself. Suddenly appearing, she startled Rondeau by saying, "What are you doing? Whose is that? Give it to me." Rondeau was anxious to conceal from her his long-buried treasure, and he passed her the other. She took it, and recognizing Mr. Miller's writing, knew also that Rondeau had given her the wrong one, so she said in a commanding tone, "What does all this mean? Give me the other one immediately." The submissive African, ever obedient to his superiors, handed her the other letter, and then in a few words told his story, and announced his intention of confessing all to his master, at the same time extending his hand to take the letters. But Julia did not mean he should have them, and she said coaxingly, "You have done very wrong, Rondeau, and your master will undoubtedly be very angry. But I will take them to him, and intercede for you, as you are on the whole a pretty fine fellow. He'll forgive you for me. I know he will. But mind, don't you say anything to him about it until you've seen me again." So saying, she returned to the house, and going to her room bolted the door. After which, breaking the seal of the oldest letter, she deliberately read it through, occasionally uttering a malediction against Mr. Miller, thanking the good luck which brought it to her hands instead of Dr. Lacey's, and making remarks generally. Said she, "Mighty good opinion Mr. Quilting Frames has of me," alluding to Mr. Miller's height. "Glad I knew his mind. A heap of good the answer to this did him. And his doll wife, too. Hadn't I better answer it myself? I'd write after this fashion: Mr. Miller, at first I thought I would treat your letter with silent contempt, but recently I have concluded to write and thank you to mind your own business. By order of George Lacey, Esquire, Julia Middleton, Secretary. Yes, that would serve the meddling old Yankee dictionary right," continued she, and then, as her eye fell upon the remaining letter, she added, "Yes, I'll read this one too, and see what new thing I'm guilty of." As soon as she broke it open and glanced at the handwriting, she knew it to be from Mrs. Carrington. "What now?" said she. "What has Mrs. Carrington got to say about me?" A rapid perusal of the letter showed her what Mrs. Carrington had to say, and she continued her remarks as follows: "She has described me quite accurately. I didn't suppose she knew me so well. I wonder who'll write next. It seems everybody is in league against me, but I'm enough for anybody there is in Kentucky, and," she added in a lower tone, "I wouldn't hesitate to try my strength with Satan himself." But even then the dark girl trembled as she thought there was a God whom none could withstand, and who one day would inevitably overtake her. Quickly as possible she drove such unpleasant thoughts from her mind, and then tried to devise the best plan for managing Mrs. Carrington. "For Mr. Miller's letter," she said, "I care nothing. It was written so long ago that he has ceased expecting an answer. But I well know Mrs. Carrington's designs, and she will continue to write until she receives some reply. I have once successfully counterfeited Dr. Lacey's handwriting, and can do it again. I'll send her something that will quiet her nerves better than assafoetida." This settled, she went in quest of Rondeau, whom she told that, as she had expected, his master was very much displeased. "But," said she, "after I interceded a while for you, he said he would forgive you, on condition that you were never guilty of the like again, and never mention the subject to him in any way, as it makes him angry to talk about it." To both these conditions Rondeau readily agreed, and Julia left him, thinking she was safe in that quarter. Several days after, Mrs. Carrington received a letter which she supposed came from Dr. Lacey. In it she was coolly requested not to interfere in other people's matters, and told that any efforts on her part to engraft herself into Dr. Lacey's good graces by malaligning Julia would be useless, and only serve to confirm him in his present low opinion of her, while at the same time it would increase the high estimation in which he held Miss Middleton. After that, Mrs. Carrington troubled Dr. Lacey with no more letters, but busied herself in anticipating the capture of a wealthy gentleman, who Ashton told her was, in the course of 2 or 3 months, coming on from Charleston, South Carolina. The scene now changes from Dr. Lacey's to the Indian Nest, on the lake shore. It was a charming spot, and looked as if intended only for the inhabitation of the pure and innocent. Yet even there was crafty ambition and base deceit. Julia was there, eagerly seeking to wind her coils securely around her long watched-for prey. To all eyes but her own she seemed not likely to succeed, for though Dr. Lacey admired her and possibly treated her with more attention than he did either Mabel or Florence, yet his heart still turned to Fanny, and for hours he would sit, talking to Julia of her sister, while she schooled herself to answer all his questions without one sign of impatience. Occasionally she would speak to Dr. Lacey of his cousin, young Stanton, and would tell how much pleasure Fanny seemed to take in his society. But this produced no effect, for Dr. Lacey had learned from Stanton himself of his approaching marriage with Miss Ashton. Then Julia pulled another string, and expatiated so largely upon Frank Cameron's sayings and doings that Dr. Lacey became really uneasy, for recently he had thought seriously of again writing to Fanny, and now he determined to do so. Without knowing it, Julia was herself the means of causing this determination to be carried into effect. One night she and Dr. Lacey had been strolling for more than an hour through the many delightful walks in the garden which lay upon the lake shore. To her great satisfaction, they were entirely alone, for Mr. Middleton and Florence were engaged in their favorite game of chess, while Mabel was eagerly listening to Ashton, who was relating to her some of his India adventures. Mabel had good sense enough to know that her efforts to win Dr. Lacey would be useless, and rather reluctantly she had given him up. Now her eyes grew brighter and her heart beat faster whenever Ashton approached. But fair Mabel, your hopes are all in vain. For Inez the Spaniard is o'er the sea, and the heart thou wouldst win is not destined for thee. As we have before said, Julia was delighted at having Dr. Lacey thus to herself, and she resolved to increase the favorable impression she knew she had already made upon him. Most admirably was her part played. Fanny herself could not have been more gentle and agreeable than was Julia, as together with Dr. Lacey she traversed the broad walks of the garden. Sweet and soothing were the words she poured into his ear, occasionally administering a little well-timed flattery, and wishing, as she had once done before to another individual in similar circumstances, that Dr. Lacey had been her brother. He did not, like Mr. Wilmot, follow up this wish by a proposition that as he was not her brother, she would accept him for a husband, but he pressed the hand, which with seeming unconsciousness had been placed on his, and said, "God knows how ardently I once hoped to be your brother, Julia." "And would you then have loved me?" asked Julia. "Me, whom few have ever loved, because they did not know me. Say, would you have loved me as a sister?" The face of her who awaited Dr. Lacey's answer was very beautiful, while tears moistened the long eyelashes, which veiled the large, bright eyes, and the tones of her voice, now more like Fanny's than ever, thrilled his every nerve. What wonder, then, that his lips for the first time touched the polished brow of the tempter, as he said, "It would be no hard task, Julia, to love you with more than a brother's love." "One more well-aimed blow," thought Julia, "and I shall have him at my feet." But she was mistaken. Between herself and Dr. Lacey there arose the image of one, the remembrance of whom had a power to prevent the utterance of words which otherwise might have been spoken. Abruptly changing the conversation, he drew her rather reluctantly toward the house, which they reached just in time to hear Florence exclaim, as she scattered the chessmen over the floor, "Why, Uncle Billy Middleton, what do you mean? Put yourself up to be played for, and then beat me. Shame! Shame!" "What is this all about?" asked Dr. Lacey, having some inkling of the truth. "Why," answered Florence, "you see Mr. Middleton has conceived a fatherly affection for me, and as he's rather rusty in such matters, he could think of no better way of proposing than to put himself up as a prize, and tell me if I beat him in playing chess, he would be mine, or in other words, make me Mrs. Billy Middleton." "And who beat?" asked Julia. "Why, Mr. Middleton was ill-mannered enough to win," said Florence. "But then it was such fun to see how desperately he played, for fear I should get him. Now, Dr. Lacey, I suppose you've been proposing to Julia in the real old orthodox way, but that is too common. You must sit down at the chessboard and let Julia play for you," and she pushed them both toward the chairs which she and Mr. Middleton had just vacated. Julia did not refuse, but Dr. Lacey, freeing himself from Florence, said, "Excuse me tonight, Miss Woodburn. Perhaps at some other time I will comply with your request." Then bowing, he left the veranda and went to his own room. When there, he strove to recall the events of the evening, and the words he had involuntarily spoken to Julia. "Why is it," said he, "that I feel so uneasy whenever I am alone with her? Is it that I love her, and am afraid I shall tell her so? No, that cannot be. I do not love her. And yet, next to Fanny, she is more agreeable to me than any one else." Memories of other days came thronging about him, and he then resolved again to write and beseech Fanny at least to grant him her second love, even if her first, best affections had been given to another. "Suppose she refuses you," seemed whispered in his ear. It must have been some evil spirit which prompted the reply, "Then I will marry Julia, as being next and nearest to Fanny." His resolution once taken, he proceeded to carry it into effect. The letter was written, and over Dr. Lacey came a sense of relief, a feeling that he had escaped from something, he knew not what. But she, who was upon his track, was more wily, more crafty than anything he had ever imagined. This time, however, her interference was not necessary, for early next morning a carriage drew up in front of the Indian Nest. From it sprang Lida Gibson, who had recently returned from New York. She was full of talk, and within an hour after her arrival, the story of Fanny's engagement with Frank Cameron had been repeated in Dr. Lacey's hearing at least 3 times. "It must be true," said Lida, "for everyone said so, and their actions proclaimed it, if nothing more. Besides, Mr. Cameron's sister Gertrude herself told me it was so." "I am not surprised," said Julia and her uncle both. For Julia's opinion Dr. Lacey possibly might not have cared, but when Mr. Middleton too added his testimony, the matter was settled. The letter was not sent. During the day Lida wondered much why Dr. Lacey stayed so closely in his room. "I should think he would roast in there," said she. "I do wonder what he is about." "I fancy," answered Florence, "that he still loves Fanny, and now that she's engaged he's staying alone until he gets his rebellious heart tied up." When Lida afterward learned the truth, she expressed a wish that her tongue might have been cut out ere she had been the bearer of news which caused so much trouble. While Dr. Lacey was securely bolted in his room, nerving himself to bear this fresh disappointment, and striving to drive each thought of Fanny from him, Julia too was alone, and busily engaged. What pains she took to rub and soil those tiny sheets of paper until they assumed a worn and crumpled look. Then dipping her finger in the silver goblet at her side, what perfect tear blots she made, and how she exulted over the probable success of her morning's work. When it was finished, she placed it in her portfolio, and waited for a favorable opportunity. It came not that day, however, for save at mealtime Dr. Lacey made not his appearance. To Mr. Middleton's inquiries concerning the reason of his seclusion he replied, that he was busy with important matters, that his abstracted manner led Mr. Middleton to believe what he had long suspected, viz., that Dr. Lacey's heart was wholly centered upon Fanny, and that the news of her coming marriage was the cause of his unhappiness. Next morning's sun rose clear and bright, but it brought a day which Dr. Lacey long, long remembered, and which Julia, in the bitterness of her heart, cursed many and many a time. In the early part of the morning, Dr. Lacey wandered down to a small arbor which stood at the foot of the garden. He had not been there long before Julia too came tripping down the walk, with her portfolio and drawing pencil. So absorbed was she in her own thoughts, that she of course did not see Dr. Lacey until she had entered the arbor. Then, with a most becoming blush and start, she said, "Pray pardon me for disturbing you. I had no idea you were here." Dr. Lacey of course insisted upon her staying. She knew he would, and sitting down, she busied herself in looking over the contents of her portfolio. Suddenly she heaved a deep sigh, and Dr. Lacey looked up just in time to see her wipe something from her eyes, or pretend to, which must have been tears. At the same time she hastily thrust a paper back into her portfolio, which she immediately shut. "What is the matter?" asked Dr. Lacey. "For whom was that sigh, and those tears?" "For poor Fan," answered Julia. "I've accidentally found a part of an old journal, which she kept while Mr. Wilmot was living." "May I see it?" asked Dr. Lacey. Julia seemed at first reluctant, but finally replied, "Perhaps it will be as well to let you do so, for you may then judge more kindly of Fanny." And she placed in his hands the soiled sheets of paper which we saw in her room. Leaning back, she watched him while he read. As we have as much right to read Fanny's journal as Dr. Lacey, we will here give a few brief extracts. April. Cease your wild beatings, my heart. Mr. Wilmot is promised to Julia. He will never be mine, and naught can prevent my loving him. Ay, for ever and ever. August 1st. I do not believe I am indifferent to Mr. Wilmot, but he will be true to his vows. He will wed Julia. And this doctor that bothers me so, what of him? Why, he is wealthy and high and handsome, but I do not love him. Yet if he offers himself I shall say yes, for as Mrs. Carrington says, he is a great catch. September 5. Mr. Wilmot is dead, and with him died my poor, poor heart. Had he lived, he possibly might have turned to me, for Julia knew how much I loved him. Dear, generous Julia! How I wish Dr. Lacey would love her, for she is more worthy of him than I am. January 1. Hi ho! I'm engaged to Dr. Lacey. Who would think it? Now I am happy. Oh no, out in the graveyard lies one who could have made me happy. Ought I thus to deceive Dr. Lacey? Why, yes, if he is satisfied it is well enough. I am ambitious, and if I can't marry for love, I will for money. And then he's given me so beautiful a piano. Oh, I hope he'll send me more presents after he gets home. January 15. Dr. Lacey has gone, and I feel relieved. But just think of it. Julia loves him devotedly. I wish he knew it. She has always loved him, and tries to make me do the same. She read me a sermon today 2 hours long about my duty. Fudge on my duty! As long as I can make Joshua and Dr. Lacey think I'm all sunshine, it's no matter if my love is all moonshine. This journal was interspersed here and there with tears, and was so exact an intimation of Fanny's writing that Dr. Lacey was completely duped. He, however, wondered that Julia should show it to him. She had foreseen this, and as he was reading the last few lines she was looking over her portfolio. Suddenly springing up, she snatched the paper from his hand, saying, "Oh, what have I done? I've shown you the wrong part of the journal. I did not mean you to see this. What shall I do? You'll hate Fanny and despise me." "Why despise you?" asked Dr. Lacey. "Because," replied Julia, "you will dislike me for the foolish thing which Fan wrote about me. I could not help her writing it." "And is it true?" asked Dr. Lacey. "Oh, you must not ask me that. I can't tell. I shan't tell." And seizing her portfolio, Julia started off toward the house, thinking possibly she should be pursued, but she was not. During the reading of the journal, Dr. Lacey's heart seemed to go through a benumbing process, which rendered it perfectly palsied. No emotion either of love or anger did he feel toward Fanny. She was naught to him. And how did the knowledge that Julia loved him affect him? Answer, any man, whether your wounded pride is never soothed by a woman's sympathy and love, come in what garb it may. And in Dr. Lacey's case it was a being of wondrous beauty, who knew well what she was about, and had marked each inch of ground ere she trod upon it. What marvel, then, that Dr. Lacey turned toward her? You would have done so, ay, perchance sooner than he did. That evening after supper, as Dr. Lacey was walking upon the veranda, Florence approached him, saying, "Come, Dr. Lacey, now fulfill your promise of playing with Julia," at the same time leading him toward the place where her companions were seated. "Now," said she, placing the chessboard in his hands, "I am mistress of ceremonies. We will have a fair understanding. If Julia beats, you shall be hers. If you beat, Mabel and Lida shall draw cuts for you. Do you agree to it?" "Certainly," was Dr. Lacey's reply, at the same time seating himself opposite Julia, who gave him a look of searching inquiry. He understood her, and in a low tone answered, "I am in earnest. Do your best." And she did her best. With one strong effort of the will she concentrated all her energies upon that game, which she felt would decide her fate. Dr. Lacey, too, as if resolved to conquer, played most skilfully. The bystanders for a time looked on, and as Lida noticed the livid hue of Julia's face, she said, "Pray, Julia, don't burst a blood vessel, for maybe Dr. Lacey will have you, even if you do not beat." But the ear she addressed was deaf save to the quiet sound of the chessmen. The contest was long and severe. 9, 10, 11 struck the little clock in the hall. One by one the spectators stole away. Florence's parting words were, "If Dr. Lacey beats, be sure and wake us, Julia, so Mabel and Lida can draw cuts." And now they were alone. Once and only once Julia glanced at the face of her antagonist. It was white and colorless as her own hand, which wandered steadily over the chessboard. The final spell was upon him, and he seemed striving hard to shake it off. 'Twas all in vain. The little clock struck the hour of midnight. The game was ended. Julia had won. Dr. Lacey was checkmated. With one hand he rapidly swept the board of its occupants, while the other he extended toward Julia, saying, "Take it. 'Tis all I can offer, for you well know I have no heart to give. My hand and name you have won. They are yours." A person less intriguing or determined than Julia would have scorned to receive a hand so coldly offered, but not so with her. She did not expect any protestations of love, for she knew he felt none. Yet she was hardly satisfied, and resolved upon one movement more ere she accepted what she felt was reluctantly given. "You are mistaken in me," said she, "if you think I will play for a husband, and then expect him to comply with the terms unless he chooses to do so." Dr. Lacey replied, "When I consented to play, I knew what I was about, and I knew, too, that you love me. I cannot say the same to you in return, but you are far from being indifferent to me. When I first knew you I disliked you, for I believed you to be passionate, jealous, and designing. Nor do I think my opinion of you then was wrong. But you are changed, very much changed. Continue to be what you are now, and we may be happy, for I may learn to love you, but never as fondly, as madly, as I loved your sister. Ay, as I could love her again. But enough of this. She was false. She deceived me, and now I will wed you." And what said Julia to all this? Why, she sat bolt upright, listening attentively while Dr. Lacey expressed his former and present opinion of her. When he had finished, she ventured to acknowledge her love for him, said she had always loved him, and that as his wife she would try to make him happy. Perhaps she was sincere in this, for she did love Dr. Lacey as well as her selfish nature would suffer her to love anyone, and she had resolved, if she ever married him, to do all in her power to atone, if possible, for the past. A half hour longer they conversed of the future, and arranged the plan, which Julia next day wrote to her sister. At last Dr. Lacey exclaimed, "Come, Julia, you must go now. It is getting late, for see," pointing to the little clock, but as if astonished at what it had heard, the clock had stopped. End of chapter 20. Recording by Amanda Friday.
Chapter 21 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 21. Stirring Events. Great was Mr. Middleton's surprise when informed by Dr. Lacey of his engagement with Julia. Something in his countenance must have betrayed it, for Dr. Lacey said, "You seem astonished, sir. Are you displeased?" "Certainly not. I am glad," answered Mr. Middleton. "Yet I confess I was surprised, for I had never thought of such a thing. Once I had hoped you would marry Fanny, but since Frank Cameron has rendered that impossible, you cannot do better than take Julia. She is intelligent, accomplished, and handsome, and although she has some faults, your influence over her will lead her to correct them." Unlike this was the reception which the intelligence met with from Dr. Lacey's negroes. "What are you saying?" asked Aunt Dilsley of Rondeau, who was communicating the important news to Leffie. "You'd better ask," replied Rondeau. "Who do you suppose Master George is going to fetch here to crack our heads for us?" "Dunno. Miss Mabel, maybe," said Aunt Dilsey. "No, sir. Miss Mabel is bad enough, but she can't hold a candle to this one," answered Rondeau. "You don't mean Miss July?" shrieked rather than asked Aunt Dilsey. "I don't mean nobody else, Mother Dilsey," said Rondeau. Up flew Aunt Dilsey's hands in amazement, and rolled her eyes in dismay. "I 'clare for't," she said, "if Master George has done made such a fool of hisself, I hope she'll pull his bar a heap worse than she did Jack's." "No danger but what she will, and yours too," was Rondeau's consoling reply. "Lord knows," said Aunt Dilsey. "First time she sasses me, I'll run away long of Jack and the baby. I'll tie up my new gown and cap in a handkerchief this night." Leffie now proposed that her mother should defer her intended flight until the arrival of the dreaded Julia, while Rondeau added, "Besides, Dilsey, if you should run away, your delicate body couldn't get further than the swamp, where you'd go in up to your neck first lunge, and all master's horses couldn't draw you out." This allusion to her size changed the current of Aunt Dilsey's wrath, which now turned and spent itself on Rondeau. Her impression of Julia, however, never changed, although she was not called upon to run away. Mrs. Lacey, too, received the news of her son's engagement with evident dissatisfaction, but she thought remonstrance would be useless, and she kept silent, secretly praying that Julia might prove better than her fears. In due course of time there came from Kentucky a letter of congratulation from Fanny, but she was so unaccustomed to say or write what she did not feel that the letter, so far as congratulations were concerned, was a total failure. She, however, denied her engagement with Frank, and this, if nothing else, was sufficient reason why Julia refused to show it to Dr. Lacey. Julia knew the chain by which she held him was brittle, and might at any time be broken, and it was not strange that she longed for the last days of October, when with Dr. Lacey she would return to Kentucky. They came at last, and one bright, cloudless morning Uncle Joshua got out his carriage and proceeded to Frankfort, where, as he had expected, he met Julia and his expected son-in-law. His greeting of the former was kind and fatherly enough, but the moment he saw the latter, he felt, as he afterwards said, an almost unconquerable desire to flatten his nose, gouge his eyes, knock out his teeth, and so forth, which operations would doubtlessly have greatly astonished Dr. Lacey, and given him what almost every man has, viz., a most formidable idea of his wife's relations. He, however, restrained his wrath, and when, at a convenient time, Dr. Lacey, with a few ominous ahms and made-up coughs, indicated his intention of asking for Julia, Uncle Joshua cut him short by saying, "Never mind, I know what you want. You may have her and welcome. I only wish she would make as good a wife as you will husband. But mind now, when you find out what for a fury you've got, don't come winning round me, for I give you fair warning." Here Dr. Lacey thought proper to say that possibly Mr. Middleton did not understand his daughter. "Not understand her?" repeated Mr. Middleton. "What's to hinder? She's my own gal, and I like her well enough. but don't I know she's as fiery as a baker's oven." "She is greatly changed," continued Dr. Lacey. "Don't you give her credit for that?" "Changed?" replied Mr. Middleton. "So's lightning changed. It's one of her tricks. Depend on it, you'll find it so." And Mr. Middleton walked off in search of his promising daughter. Strange as it may seem, the old man's remarks had no other effect on Dr. Lacey than to cause him to pity Julia, who he fancied was misunderstood and misused. He believed her reformation to be sincere, and could not help feeling that Mr. Middleton was mistaken in his opinion of both his daughters. After trampling all over the house, banging doors, and shouting at least a dozen times, "Oh, Tempest, where for gracious sakes are you?" Mr. Middleton at length found his daughter in Mrs. Miller's room, consulting with Kate about her bridal dress. Kate, too, was wholly deceived by Julia's gentleness and apparent frankness of manner, and readily complied with her request that she should be with her the 2 days preceding the marriage, for the purpose of assisting in the arrangements of affairs. This being settled, Mr. Middleton and his daughter started for home, which they reached about sunset. Julia leaped gaily from the carriage, and running into the house, embraced her mother and received the blacks as affectionately as Fanny herself could have done. Then, missing her sister, she asked, "Where is Fan? Why does she not come to meet us?" Mrs. Middleton looked inquiringly at her husband, who replied, "No, I ain't told her, just because she didn't ask me. Sunshine is sick in bed, and has had the potpourri 3 times." "Fanny sick?" said Julia. "Where is she? In her room? I will go to her immediately." But in going to Fanny, it was necessary to pass the parlor, and Julia could not resist the temptation to look in and see if the old man had fixed up anything. "Oh, how neat! How pleasant!" was her first exclamation, and truly the cheerless old room had undergone a great renovation. It had been thoroughly cleaned and repainted. The walls were hung with bright, cheerful-looking paper. A handsome carpet covered the floor, while curtains of corresponding beauty shaded the windows. The furniture, tastefully arranged, was nearly all new, and in the waxen flowers which filled the vases on the mantelpiece, Julia recognized the handiwork of her sister. Yes, Fanny's love had wrought this change. At first her father had refused to do anything. "No, I won't," said he. "It's good enough, and if it don't suit Lady Tempest, she can go to the Holmes barn. That's just fit for 'em." "Then, father," said Fanny, "do it for my sake. It would please me to have a pleasanter parlor." This was sufficient. A well-filled purse was placed in Fanny's hand, with liberty to do as she pleased. Then, with untiring love, aching heart, and throbbing temples, she worked on day after day until all was completed, parlor, bridal chamber, and all. The hangings and drapery of the latter were as white and pure as was she who so patiently worked on, while each fresh beauty added to the room pierced her heart with a deeper anguish, as she thought what and whom it was for. When her mother remonstrated against such unceasing toil, she would smile a sweet, sad smile, and say, "Don't hither me, dear mother. 'Tis all I can do to show my love for Julia, and after I am gone, they will perhaps think more kindly of me when they know how I worked for them." At last all was done. The finishing stroke was given, and then came a reaction. Fanny took her bed, and her father, instantly alarmed, called the nearest physician. Dr. Gordon readily saw that Fanny's disease was in her mind, and in reply to Mrs. Middleton's inquiries, He frankly told his opinion, and said that unless the cause of her melancholy could be removed, the consequence might be fatal. "Don't tell my husband," said Mrs. Middleton. "His life is bound up in Fanny, and the day that sees her dead will, I fear, also make me a widow." Accordingly, Mr. Middleton was deceived into a belief that Fanny's illness was the result of overexertion, and that she would soon recover. In a day or two she seemed better, but was not able to come downstairs. Instead, she had no desire or intention of doing so until after the wedding, for she felt she could not, would not, see Dr. Lacey for the world. Since the receipt of her sister's letter, she had been given a holier love, a firmer faith than aught on earth can bestow, and she was now under the influence of religion, of lasting, true religion. This then was the reason why she welcomed her sister so affectionately, and felt no emotion either of resentment or anger toward those who were thus trampling on the bleeding fibers of her heart. As Julia kissed the almost transparent brow of her sister, and clasped her thin white fingers, tears gathered in her eyes, and she thought, "This ruin I have wrought, and for it I must answer." But not long did she ever suffer her conscience to trouble her, and the next hour she was chatting away to Fanny about the preparations for her wedding, which was to take place 1 week from that day. Fanny listened as one who heard not. She was praying for more grace, more strength to endure yet a little longer. Slowly to Julia dragged the days of that week, while to Fanny they sped on rapid wing, and now everything within and without the house betokened the coming event. Servants scampered hither and thither, thinking they were doing it all, while in reality they were doing nothing. Mrs. Middleton scolded the blacks, and Uncle Joshua scolded Mrs. Middleton, at the same time walking mechanically from the kitchen to the parlor, from the parlor to Fanny's sick room, and from Fanny's sick room back to the kitchen, occasionally kicking from his path some luckless kitten, dog, or black baby, which latter set up most lusty yells, just to vary the scene. In the midst of all this, Fanny lay calmly and quietly on her low bed, counting each succeeding sun as it rose and set, bringing nearer and nearer a day she so much dreaded. True to her promise, Kate Miller came 2 days before the wedding. Fanny was asleep when she entered the room to see her, but on the white, wasted face Kate's tears fell as she said, "Poor Fanny, I did not know she was so ill." Mr. Middleton, who was present, muttered, "Yes, cursed be the one who made her so." He knew not that he cursed his own child. The next day Mr. William Middleton arrived, bringing the intelligence that Florence and Mabel had accompanied him, and would next evening be present at the wedding. Slowly the last rays of a bright October sun faded in the west, giving no sign of the stormy day which was to succeed. Long after midnight a lone watcher sat by the window in Fanny's room, gazing at the stars, which looked so quietly on from their distant homes, and praying, not for herself, but for Dr. Lacey, that he might be happy with her he had chosen. At last, chilled with the night air, she crept shivering to her pillow, nor woke again until aroused by the fierce moaning of the autumn wind, which shook the casement, and by the sound of the driving rain, which beat against the pane. Yes, the morning which dawned on Julia's bridal day was wild and stormy, but before noon the clouds cleared away, and the afternoon was dry, hot, and oppressive, a precursor to the mightier and more wrathful storm which followed. About 5 o'clock there was a noise in the yard, and Kate, who was in Fanny's room, arranging her young friend's hair, looked from the window and said, "It is Dr. Lacey. Julia has looked for him for more than 3 hours." Quickly Fanny hurried to the window. She could not meet Dr. Lacey face to face, but she wished to look at him once more. She was too late, however. He had entered the house, and soon the sound of his voice reached her ear. He had not been there long ere he asked for Fanny. On being told she was sick, he seemed rather disturbed. Possibly, however, he felt relieved to know she would not be present when he took upon him vows which should have been breathed to her. Ashton, Florence, and Mabel now arrived, and soon after came Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, accompanied by Mrs. Carrington, who had been invited because it would not do to slight her, and who came because she had a mind to. The ceremony was to take place at 7 o'clock, and guests each moment arrived, until the parlor seemed almost full. Alone in her chamber sat Fanny, listening to the sounds of mirth, which grated on her ear. Night, dark and stormy, was gathering over the earth, but a darker night lay round the heart of the young girl, as she watched from her pillow a dense black pile of clouds which had appeared in the west, and now increased until the whole sky was overspread as with a pall of darkness. White distant peals of muttered thunder announced the coming storm. And now louder roared the howling wind, and brighter the glaring lightning flashed, while fiercer grew the conflict in Fanny's bosom. Her faith was weak, and well nigh blotted with tears of human weakness, but he whose power could stay the storm without could also still the agony within, and o'er the troubled waters of that aching heart there fell a peaceful calm. Suddenly the door opened, and a creature of wondrous, dazzling beauty appeared. It was Julia in her bridal robe. She would fain have her sister's blessing ere she descended to the parlor. The struggle was over, and the blessing which Fanny gave her sister was sincere. But when Julia asked forgiveness for all the evil she had ever done, the reply was prevented by a crash of thunder so terrific that Julia trembled with terror and hastily left the room. In a moment there was a light step upon the stair. Fanny knew it was Dr. Lacey, for he soon returned with Julia, and as they passed her door, she heard the merry laugh of Florence, who was bridesmaid. In an instant they were in the parlor, throughout which a general gloom seemed to reign. Perhaps it was owing to the wildness of the storm, which each moment increased in fury. The bridal party took their places, and Uncle Joshua shut his eyes, while the marriage ceremony commenced. The reader may now accompany me to the border of yonder wood, where stands a low-roofed building, the property of Mrs. Dunn. There, in a darkened room, lay the widow's only son, raving in the madness of delirium. The fever flame burned in each vein, and as he tossed from side to side, he would shriek out, "Quick, I tell you, or you are too late! She must not wed him. Don't you know she's doubly, trebly steeped in guilt? Go quick, I tell you, and stop it!" Mrs. Dunn could only weep, for she knew not, dreamed not, what her son could mean. Soon he grew calm and fell into a deep sleep. When he awoke, Billy Jeffrey, who lived near, was sitting by him. To Mrs. Dunn's delight, Joseph was sane, and calling her to him, he said, "Isn't Julia Middleton to be married tonight?" "She is," answered his mother. "At what hour?" "At 7. "What time is it now?"
6:30, replied Mrs. Dunn.
"It must not be," said Joseph, and turning to Bill, he added, "Listen, William, to what I have to tell, then speed along on the lightning's wing, and tear her from the altar. Take her from his side, I say, and put there the other one, the pale, golden-haired one." Then, as he noticed the vacant look on Bill's face, he added, "Oh no, you can't tell it. You wouldn't understand it. Mother, bring me a pen and some paper." The paper was brought, and as soon as possible Joseph wrote a confession of his own and Julia's guilt. "Now, Bill," said he, "run for your life, and give this to Dr. Lacey. Do it for the sake of Fanny." Bill needed no second bidding. His obtuse intelligence had gathered that in some way Fanny was in danger, and away he flew over bushes, briars, rocks, and ditches. But alas! the way was long and dark, and ere he was aware of it, he was precipitated into one of the sinkholes which are so common in the limestone soil of Kentucky. The fool sprained his ankle, but gathering himself up, he continued on, slowly and painfully. Meantime delirium had again crept over Joseph Dunn, and he forgot that he sent Billy, but concluded he must go himself. Watching a time when his mother was from the room, he rose, and throwing on his double gown, went forth into the storm, and was soon far on his road toward Mr. Middleton. The man of God had scarcely finished the second paragraph of the episcopal ceremony, beginning with, "I require and charge you both," etc., when a shriek wild and unearthly and horrid rent the air. It was succeeded by a thunder crash so deafening that the ladies paled with terror. The large maple tree which stood by the front door, and which Julia had called hers, was shivered by lightning, but no one heeded it, for again was heard that fearful maniacal shriek, and this time could not be distinguished the sound as of someone who struggling with the blacks, who were huddled together in the hall. "Let me go, I tell you," said the voice. "It shall not go on." All eyes turned toward the door, as Joseph Dunn appeared, shouting, "Stop it! Stop it! She forged those letters! She broke her sister's heart! Stop it, I say!" Every person in the room seemed terror-stricken at the wild spectacle he presented. His face, wasted to a mere skeleton, was ghastly white, while his long yellow hair hung in matted locks about his brow, and a look of wild frenzy was in his eye, as darting toward the paralyzed Julia, he seized her as with a lion's grasp and shook her most furiously. Bill Jeffrey was close behind. He had lost his hat, and the rain had soaked his thick hair until it clung closely to his head, giving him, too, a strange appearance. Mr. William Middleton now came forward to ask an explanation of Joseph, who, chancing to see Bill, said, "He's got the letter, my confession. Read that. I am too exhausted," and he fell upon the floor. No one noticed him, for all gazed intently at Bill, who drew from his pocket a paper and presented it to Dr. Lacey. In a calm, clear voice, Dr. Lacey read aloud the confession, in the midst of thunder, lightning, groans, cries, and oaths, the latter of which were the spontaneous production of Uncle Joshua, who sat still in his chair until the confession was read through. Then with one bound he reached Julia, and raising her from the floor, said, "Speak, Satan, and tell if this is true." Julia was overtaken, surrounded on all sides, and there was no way of escape. Mechanically she answered, "I am guilty," while a burst of exclamation ran round the room. A stifled moan of agony came from Dr. Lacey's parted lips, and he asked in a voice which plainly told his suffering, "Oh, why was I suffered to go thus far? Why did no one write?" "I did," answered Mrs. Miller. "And I too," repeated Mrs. Carrington. "But you spurned my letter and treated me with contempt." "Never, never," scarcely articulated Dr. Tracy. "I never received them. But call Rondeau. He must know something of it." Rondeau, who had accompanied his master, was called. Explanation followed explanation. Testimony crowded upon testimony, and Julia acknowledged all, until at length Dr. Lacey, frantic with the sense of wrong done him, turned to her and said, "Base woman, why have you done this? Your sin has found you out ere it was too late, for thank God you are not my wife, nor ever will be." Julia now lost all command of herself. Tearing the bridal veil from her brow, she rent it in twain. Then from her arms she snatched a diamond bracelet and trampled it under her feet, while a stream of blood issued from her mouth and stained her white satin dress. A moment more, and she too was extended on the floor by the side of her ally. Where during this exciting scene was Fanny? The direful sounds had reached her ear, and now at the head of the stairs she listened to the babel which reigned in the parlour. High above all other voices she distinguished her father's, who, in his uncontrollable fury, was calling to use all the oaths he had ever heard of, besides manufacturing some expressly for the occasion. Then there was a heavy fall, accompanied by a cry from Mrs. Middleton of, "Lift her up! Carry her out! Don't you see she is dying?" Fanny hesitated no longer, but quickly descending the stairs, she forced her way through the blacks into the parlour, where she stood appalled at the scene before her. On the floor lay Julia, who in a few moments before stood there represented in beauty. Near her sat the maniac, Joseph Dunn. He had recovered from his fainting fit, and was now crouching over the prostrate form of Julia, laughing in his delirious glee as he wiped from her lips the red drops of blood. In a corner of the room a group had gathered near an open window, through which they were bearing an inanimate object. It was Florence, who had fainted, and as it seemed impossible to effect a passage through the hall, so filled was it with terrified servants, they had sought the window as the best means of egress. Suddenly over that excited assembly there came a deep silence. It was caused by the appearance of Fanny, who, with her loose white muslin wrapper and long curls, which floated over her shoulders, seemed like some being from another world, come to say that storm of passion. Mabel, who was occupied with her cousin, looked back as the calm hush fell upon them, and then and there she first saw Fanny Middleton. The scene was too much for Fanny, and she too would have fainted had not Dr. Lacey caught her in his arms. Clasping her slight form passionately to his bosom, he exclaimed, "My own, my Fanny, my wife, for such are you, and such you will be." Mr. William Middleton and Mr. Miller, who were bearing Julia from the room, now passed them. Dr. Lacey glanced once at the corpse-like face over which the heavy braids of long black hair had fallen. Then, with a shudder, he again strained Fanny to his heart, saying, thank God I escaped her in time." Then turning to the minister, who all this time had stood looking on in mute astonishment, he added in an authoritative manner, "Go on with the ceremony, sir, and make her my wife." But a new thought entering his mind, he released Fanny and said, "Pardon me, dear Fanny. Sorrow has well nigh bereft me of my senses. In my first joy in finding you innocent, I forgot that you could not be mine, for you belong to another, to Mr. Cameron." "Cameron go to thunder!" exclaimed Uncle Joshua, who was still standing near. "That's another of Tempest's lies. She never was engaged to him, never loved him, or any other mortal man, save yourself." Here Fanny, who, it will be remembered, was all this time ignorant of the truth, asked if someone would not explain what she saw and heard. "I will," said Dr. Lacey. "It is my duty to do so," and he led her to a window, where he hurriedly told her all, everything which he himself knew, intermingling his words with so much passionate embraces that his sanity was much to be doubted. He had scarcely finished his story when Kate approached him, saying, For humanity's sake, Dr. Lacey, if you have any skill, exert it in behalf of Julia, who seems to be dying." Dr. Lacey arose, and winding his arm about Fanny, as if afraid he might lose sight of her, moved toward the room where Julia lay. They had borne her to the bridal chamber, which Fanny had arranged with so much care, and as Dr. Lacey appeared at the door, Uncle Joshua met him and said, "I know she served you mean, but I would not have her die. She is my own child, and you must save her if you can." At the same time he pointed to Julia, who lay in the same death-like trance, with the blood still issuing slowly from her livid lips. All that Dr. Lacey could do, he did, but when Dr. Gordon arrived, he gladly gave up his charge to him, and turned his attention toward Fanny, who, overcome by what she had seen and heard, had fainted, and been carried to her own room, where she was surrounded by Mrs. Carrington, Florence, and Mabel. These ladies ran against each other, except the Capor bottle, dropped the lamp, and spilled half the cologne, in their zealous efforts to take care of their patient. In the midst of their confusion, Dr. Lacey entered, and they immediately gave up to him the task of restoring her. This he soon did, for it would seem that his very voice had a power to recall Fanny's suspended faculties. Slowly her eyes unclosed, then, as if wearied out, she again closed them, and for a time slept sweetly, calmly, on Dr. Lacey's bosom. The guests now began to depart, and Bill Jeffrey, who had been sent to inform Mrs. Dunn of her son, returned with some of the neighbors and carried Joseph away. Owing to the darkness of the night, the company from Frankfort remained until morning, but no eyelid closed in sleep. With maternal solicitude, Mrs. Middleton sat by the bedside of her daughter Julia, whose eyes opened once, but on seeing Dr. Lacey standing nearby, she closed them again with a shudder, and a faint wail of anguish escaped her. She had ruptured a small blood vessel, but Dr. Gordon said there was no danger if she could be kept quiet for a few days. Uncle Joshua, thus relieved from alarm concerning her, walked back and forth from her room to Fanny's, swearing that he knew the devil was let loose that night for his special benefit, and that he had come up there to see how much of a row he could get up. "He succeeded admirably, I think," said Florence, who, having recovered from her first fright, was now ready to extract whatever fun could be gathered from the surrounding circumstances. In the kitchen the blacks canvassed the matter after their fashion. Aunt Judy lamented because none of the tempting supper in the dining room was touched, while Bob did not fail to turn his usual round of somersaults, thus evincing his joy that so many good things were left for him to eat. "'Cause," he said, "in course, Will Alice has all that comes off the table." Aunt Katy took occasion to lecture the young black girls on the awful sin of conceit, as she called it, pointing them for an example to Julia, who would most likely have to live an old maid all her days. She couldn't have threatened a worse punishment, for many of the negresses had already their own preferences in favor of certain mulatto boys on their master's plantation, and others adjoining. Rondeau seemed to think his sympathy was only needed by his young master, whom he looked upon as a much abused man. From the first he had felt great contempt for the old house, its master, servants, and all, and had come to the conclusion that they were of no count anyhow. This opinion would doubtless have been reserved for Leffie's ear, had not affairs taken so unexpected a turn. Now, however, Rondeau felt at liberty to express his mind so freely that Ike considered it his duty to resent the insult. A regular negro fight ensued, in which Aunt Katy, who was not very active, was thrown down as she loudly protested every atom of breath was kicked out of her. The big chicken pie was also turned over into Rondeau's new hat, greatly to the satisfaction of Tiger and the other dogs, who had mingled in the farce. The riot was finally quelled by Mr. William Middleton and Dr. Lacey, Uncle John declaring he wouldn't interfere that night if the niggers all fit till they killed themselves. End of chapter 21. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England. Chapter 22 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 22. Julia is found drowned. The morning which succeeded the events narrated in the last chapter was clear and bright. Nature, beautiful as ever, looked as if laughing defiance at the fearful storm which so lately had swept over the earth. Beautifully over hill and valley fell the sun's red rays, but when they penetrated the dwelling of Mr. Middleton, they shone on the anxious, careworn faces of those who had been sleepless during the dark hours of that dreadful night. Even the merry-hearted Florence seemed sad and spiritless as she hurried from room to room, urging Ashton to accelerate their departure. By 8 o'clock the last guest was gone. Around the old stone house a gloomy silence settled, broken only by the heavy tramp of Uncle Joshua, whose cowhides came down with a vengeance as up and down the yard he strode, talking to Dr. Lacey, who walked by his side. "Now," said he, "if this isn't a little the all-firedest muss a feller ever got into. Joshua ain't no judge. Of course the papers have nothing to do but flout it all over the country. For myself, I don't care a copper, but 'twill be mighty mortifying to you, though I think you deserve some mortifying, for how in thunder a chap of your senses ever came to be made such a precious fool of is more'n I can tell. If you knew all the arts she employed, you would not wonder quite so much," said Dr. Lacey, and Mr. Middleton answered, "Know all her arts? Don't I know 'em? Don't I suppose that she rummaged heaven and earth for ways and means?" "I hardly think she went to the former place for assistance," said Dr. Lacey, and Mr. Middleton continued, "You are right, but I'll be bound Satan hadn't any tricks but what he told her of. Pears like she's been possessed ever since she first opened her big black eyes in the very room where the row was last night. Oh, happy I was," he continued, "when I took her in my arms a little baby, and knew she was mine and Nancy's, and thought what a comfort she'd be to me. But, George, I tell you what," said he, as he placed one hand on Dr. Lacey's arm and passed the other through the grizzled locks which lay around his brow, "I tell you what, these gray hairs come a heap too soon, and all for her. For her. Oh, Julia, Julia, what trouble have you not caused me?" And in his hands Dr. Joshua buried his face, while through his large red fingers the tears trickled slowly and fell upon the ground. For a moment he wept, and then wiping his eyes said, "But wasn't it lucky that long-legged, solemn-colored Joe got here as he did? Another minute and you'd have been clinched. But now the tempest has blowed over, and for the rest of your life you'll have nothing but sunshine." The overseer now approached to ask orders concerning a piece of work in which the negroes were employed. Mr. Middleton accompanied him to the field, while Dr. Lacey returned to the house in quest of Fanny. He was told that she was with Julia, and with an involuntary shudder he approached the chamber which contained one who had well nigh been his wife. His wife! The very idea filled him with loathing when associated with her, and still he pitied the suffering girl, divested of her bridal attire, now lay moaning in pain. With coming day had come a burning fever, which increased so rapidly that Dr. Gordon shook his head when questioned as to the result. The change of affairs had also wrought a change in Fanny, who seemed and really was better than she had been for many days. Gladly she would have stayed with Dr. Lacey, but she felt that duty called her to Julia's bedside. With unwearying devotion she hung over the pillow of her sister, who seemed more quiet when she knew Fanny was near. Once she looked wistfully in her face, and appeared as if anxious to speak, but Fanny gently laid her hand on her lips, saying, "No, no, Julia, you must not." She did, however, and the words, "Forgive me," met Fanny's ear. Had Fanny been less of a Christian, forgiveness might have been hard, but now she answered sincerely, truthfully, "As I hope for pardon in heaven, so do I forgive you for the great wrong you have done me." At the mention of the word heaven, Julia shuddered, and after a time repeated, "Heaven, you will find it, but I never." Earnestly then did Fanny speak of a Saviour's love, which receives all, pardons all, who come to him. Julia shook her head despairingly, and as the conversation seemed to annoy her, Fanny ceased talking, while a voice behind her said, "Teach me, too, the way of life, for I fear I have never walked in it." It was Dr. Lacey, who, unobserved by either of the girls, had entered and been a listener to what Fanny said. As Julia heard the sound of voices, she turned toward him a look so imploring, so full of contrition and entreaty, that he was moved, and approaching the bedside, took the vacant seat near Fanny. But he did not, like her, breathe words of forgiveness, for his heart was full of bitterness toward her. As he sat there gazing coldly, sternly at her, she again spoke, "If you can, if you will only forgive me." Dr. Lacey's brow grew dark and his manner excited, as he replied, "Forgive you? In time I may learn to do so, but to forget will take me my lifetime, and yet I blame myself not less than I do you for having been so duped." A low sob was Julia's only answer as Dr. Lacey arose to leave, announcing to Fanny his intention of visiting Joseph Dunn, who was said to be dying. As he entered the house where Joseph lay, tossing in feverish agony, the sick man's eyes glared wildly upon him as he shrieked, "Why have you come to taunt me with my crime? Is it not enough that the room is full of little devils who creep over my pillow and shout in my ear as they hold to view the letters I withheld? I did not do it alone. She bribed me with gold, and now when I am dead, who will take care of my mother? She will be cold when the winter winds blow, and hungry when the summer corn ripens." Dr. Lacey drew nearer to him, and stooping down whispered, "Is your mother very poor, and you all her dependents?" Yes, answered Joseph, whose almost only virtue was the love he bore his mother. "Fear not, then," said Dr. Lacey. "I will care for her, for though you did me a great wrong, you saved me from being today the most wretched of men." The night as the October sun went down, there was heard beneath that lovely roof of the piteous cry of a widowed mother, for Joseph, her firstborn, her only child, was dead. Next day they buried him, as is frequently the custom in Kentucky, beneath a large shade tree in the garden. Many words of sympathy were spoken to the bereaved mother, but none fell so soothingly on her ears as did those of Dr. Lacey, who was present at the funeral and led the weeping mother to the grave. After the burial was over, he whispered to her, "I will surely remember you, for erring through your son may have been, I owe him a debt of gratitude." So saying, he walked hastily away toward Mr. Middleton's, where he was met by alarmed faces, soft footsteps, and subdued whispers. In reply to his inquiries, he was told by Aunt Judy that somehow or another Miss Julia had got wind of Mr. Dunn's death, and it had gone to her head, making her raving mad, and the doctor said she wouldn't get well. Aunt Judy was right. Julia had accidentally heard of Mr. Dunn's death, and it added greatly to the nervous excitement which she was already suffering. And when Dr. Gordon came, he was surprised to find the dangerous symptoms of his patient increased to an alarming extent. The fever had settled upon her brain, and for many days she lay at the very gates of death. Incessantly she talked of Dr. Lacey, Fanny, and Mr. Wilmot, the latter of whom, in her disordered imagination, was constantly pursuing her. Go back to your grave," she would say. "There are tears enough shed for you, but none will fail for me when I am dead. He will laugh and be glad, and the first moon that shines on my grave will light the marriage train to the altar." Then, as if the phantom was still near her, she would cry out, "Take him away, I tell you. What have I to do with coffins and white faces and broken hearts? I killed him, I know, and he loved me too, as no one else ever has, but I madly loved another, and now he hates me, spurns me." Then turning to Fanny, she would say, "I broke your heart too, and still pressed on when I saw it was killing you, but you forgave me, and now you must plead with him, who loves the air you breathe, to think compassionately of me. I do not ask him to love me, for I know that is impossible, but he can, at least, forgive and forget the past." Sometimes she would speak of her father, saying, "He will be glad when the tempest is still and ceases to trouble him, for he never loved me, never spoke to me as he did to Fanny. I know I did not deserve his love, but I should have been better if he had given me a little, yes, just a little." "God knows she speaks the truth," said Uncle Joshua, wiping away the tears he was not ashamed to weep. "I have been mighty hard on her, but I never supposed she cared." Such were the scenes which daily occurred in Julia's sick room, until at last, from utter exhaustion, she became still, and for many days she lay in a dreamy kind of sleep. "Will she live?" asked Mr. Middleton of Dr. Gordon, as he one day left the sick room. "With proper care, I think she may," was the answer, and then Dr. Lacey again urged the request he had once before made of Mr. Middleton. But Uncle Joshua answered, "No, George, wait a little longer. Nothing will come betwixt you again, I reckon, and I wouldn't have you marry her while t'other one is so low." So Dr. Lacey was obliged to wait, but he thought he would much rather have remained near Fanny. He deemed it expedient to change his abode and remove to Mrs. Crane's. He was partly induced to do this on Rondeau's account, who, being Ike's sworn enemy, was the cause of no little annoyance to Mr. Middleton, who, with his negroes, was much nettled by the air of superiority which that young gentleman thought proper to assume. Greatly was Rondeau delighted to exchange the crazy old stone house, with its corn bread and fried bacon, for Mrs. Crane's elegant place, with its oyster soups and ice creams, a part of which the head cook always reserved for the "colored gentleman from New Orleans," who assured her that though when at home he didn't exactly eat at the same table with his master, he still lived on the top shelf. Not long, however, did Rondeau enjoy his new quarters, for about that time Mr. William Middleton returned to New Orleans, and Dr. Lacey sent with him his servant Rondeau, nothing loath to return home, for Letty's face of late had haunted him not a little. Dr. Lacey's return to Mrs. Crane's gave great satisfaction to Mrs. Carrington, who, though she had no hopes of winning him, still, to use her own words, took it in great delight in reminding him of the snare into which he had fallen, notwithstanding his profound wisdom and boasted foresight. It required all the good breeding he was master of to answer politely when, after returning from a visit to Mr. Middleton's, she would jeeringly ask him concerning his bride's health. But Mrs. Carrington's levity was brought to an end by an unforeseen circumstance. It was now 6 weeks since the evening of the denouement, and Julia's health was so much improved that Dr. Lacey began to speak confidently of the day when Fanny would be his own. Uncle Joshua had given his consent, and preparations for the marriage had actually commenced, when Julia, in whose room Mrs. Middleton had been in the habit of sleeping, insisted on being left alone. "I am well now," she said, "and do not need you." Mrs. Middleton was finally persuaded, but charged her daughter to be sure and call her if she wished for her during the night. Over Julia's face a meaning smile flitted as she answered, "I hope to trouble no one much longer," but it was unnoticed by Mrs. Middleton, and Julia was left alone. Early next morning, Luce went as usual to make a fire for her young mistress, after which she softly drew back the bed curtains to see if Julia slept. She was surprised to find no Julia there, neither were there signs of her having been there during the night. With a loud cry, Luce summoned to the room both Mr. and Mrs. Middleton, the former of whom, on seeing how matters stood, exclaimed, "So ho, up to her tricks again. I thought she couldn't hold good long. The devil when sick a saint would be, but when he got well the devil a saint was he." "Don't, husband," said Mrs. Middleton. "Perhaps she will never come back alive, and then you will be sorry." Uncle Joshua readily guessed his wife's meaning, and turning to Luce, said, "Rout out the whole gang and send 'em to hunting." In less than 2 hours, scores of men on horseback were seen hunting in all directions, as Bob expressed it, "for all the world as they was hunting a runaway." Ere long the news reached Frankfort, causing Mrs. Carrington to sneeringly advise Dr. Lacey, "by all the means to join in the hunt." He deigned her no reply, but mounting his horse took the road to Mr. Middleton's, where he was welcomed with tears by Mrs. Middleton and Fanny, whose fears he strove to allay. Meanwhile the search went on, headed by Uncle Joshua, who, late in the afternoon, unconsciously led a part of the company to the banks of the river, not far from a point called Woodford Landing. Dismounting, he strolled along the shore for several rods, when suddenly a loud cry turned toward him the attention of the party. Near the water's edge he had discovered a shawl, which he knew belonged to Julia, and nearby lay a pair of slippers, on the inside of which her name was marked. Instantly the conviction flashed upon all: Julia was drowned. Upon a large flat rock Uncle Joshua sat down, while his long gray locks were tossed by the November wind, which swept mournfully by, bearing on its wing the bitter tones with which the stricken father bewailed his loss. "Everything goes against me," said he. "Everything. She's dead, and worse than all, died by her own hand." Then, as if void of reason, he arose, and over the craggy hillside and down the dark, rolling river echoed the loud, shrill cry of "Julia! Julia! Oh, my child! Come back, come back! Why was you left to break your old father's heart?" And to that wail of sorrow only the moaning wind replied, and faster the waters of the Kentucky rolled on. They took the old man home, and long weary days went by, during which the river near the landing was dragged again and again, and still no trace of the missing girl was found. Then, as hope began to whisper that possibly she was not dead, the papers far and near contained advertisements for her, and by the side of that appeared another for a lunatic girl who had escaped from the asylum at Lexington. 4 weeks went by, and the waters of Kentucky frowned angrily in the gray December light, making Uncle Joshua shudder whenever he chanced to pass by, and thought perhaps his daughter lay sleeping in their cold embrace. A gloomy, drizzly day was settling into a dark, rainy night, when 2 young men, who, either for business or pleasure, had rowed across the river some miles from Woodford Landing, started to return home. They had stepped into their boat and were about pushing off, when among some driftwood, which lay not far from the shore, they thought they descried a female's garment floating on the water. The spot was soon reached, and to their horror they discovered the body of a young girl, which, from its appearance, must have been in the water some time. They had heard the story of Julia, and readily concluded that the bloated, disfigured form before them must have been she. Taking her to the nearest dwelling, they dispatched a messenger for Mr. Middleton, who, now that his worst fears were confirmed, seemed paralyzed with the shock. "Oh, I cannot go," said he. "I cannot. Is there no one to do it for me?" Dr. Lacey, who chanced to be present, said, "For your sake, sir, and for Fanny's, I will go." "God bless you, George," answered Mr. Middleton, and in a few moments Dr. Lacey departed. With a thrill of horror he looked upon the swollen, discolored face, round which the long black hair clung, matted and slimy from being so long saturated with water, and thought that this was once the beautiful Julia, though now so fearfully changed that no one could possibly have recognized her. Owing to the state which the body was in, Dr. Lacey thought proper to produce a coffin before removing her home. Consequently, it was nearly 10 o'clock the following morning ere the little procession slowly entered the yard, from which, with wonderful forethought, Mr. Middleton had ordered to be removed some half-dozen carts, corn cribs, etc. Fanny was pressing forward to look at her unfortunate sister, when Dr. Lacey gently but firmly led her away, saying, "No, Fanny, you must not see her. The sight would haunt you for months and years." Then, as her tears fell last, he strove in various ways to divert her mind from Julia's untimely end. About noon a middle-aged man came to the house and asked permission to see the body. His request was granted, but he almost immediately turned away from the coffin, saying by way of explanation, "I am the father of the maniac girl who some time since escaped from Lexington, and I thought perhaps this might be my daughter, but it is not, and even if it were, I could not recognize her." On Mr. Middleton's farm, and not far from the house, was a small yard which had been enclosed as a burial place for the family. On this spot Fanny had expended much time and labor. Roses and honeysuckles ever bloomed there for a season, while the dark evergreen and weeping willow waved their branches and beckoned the passer-by to rest beneath their shadow. In one corner was a tall forest maple, where Julia and Fanny often had played, and where Fanny once, when dangerously ill in childhood, had asked to be laid. As yet no mound had rendered that spot dearer for the sake of the lost one who slept there, but now in the scarcely frozen ground of the ringing the spade was heard. Shovelful after shovelful of earth was thrown up, and into that cold, damp grave, as the sun was setting, they lowered the remains of Julia, who once little thought that she first of all would break the turf of the family graveyard. That night was the first merging into the hours of morning ere the sound of Uncle Joshua's footsteps ceased, as again and again he traversed the length and breadth of his sleeping room, occasionally stopping before the window and peering out in the darkness toward the spot where he knew lay that newly made grave. Memory was busily at work, and in the events which marked Julia's short life, oh, how much he saw for which to blame himself. Remorse mingled in the old man's cup of affliction, and while the hot tears rolled down his cheeks, he exclaimed, "If only she could come back, and I could do it over. I love her more, and maybe she'd be better, but I treated her mean, and in only her harsh words and cross looks." Then, as his wife's tears mingled with his, he took her hand, saying, "Don't take on so, Nancy. You've nothing to cry for. You've always been good to her, and kind I took up for her when I got so ailing her." Mrs. Middleton could only answer by her tears to this touching attempt at sympathy, but she finally succeeded in quieting her husband, and before daybreak he had forgotten in sleep the injustice done to Julia. All thoughts of Fanny's marriage for the present were of course given up, although Mr. Middleton promised that when the autumn came round again he would surely give his treasure to the care of another. 2 weeks after Julia's burial, all of which time was passed at Mr. Middleton's, Dr. Lacey went back to New Orleans, having first placed in Mr. Middleton's care a sum of money for the benefit of Mrs. Dunn, promising Fanny that with the spring he would come again. He bade her adieu, praying that nothing might come between them again. Heavily now dragged the days at Mr. Middleton's, until Uncle Joshua hit upon a plan which would not only give pleasure to Fanny, but would also relieve the tedium of his own life. It was nothing more or less than the erection of a new house on a grassy lawn, which Fanny had frequently pointed out as being a good location. Long he revolved in his mind the for and against, but the remembrance of Julia's wish to have the old shell fixed up finally decided him. If 'twasn't good enough for her to be married in, it surely wasn't good enough for Sunshine. At the breakfast table he first announced his intention, causing Fanny in her surprise and joy not only to drop her knife, but also to upset her coffee. "All right," said he, "I'll do it, if it breaks me. We'll have a buster," said he. "Marble monthly's widows that come to the floor, Brussels carpets, and if you're a mind to, you may have them four-legged split things, though Lord knows I'll never eat with them." In a short time the necessary arrangements were completed. A large number of men were hired, and matters progressed so rapidly that there was every probability of the house being completed in early June, should the winter season prove favorable. Here we may as well relate a little circumstance which occurred to Fanny during the winter. Bill Jeffrey, who, it will be remembered, had always felt a predilection for her, emboldened by the kindness of her manner, now determined to make his wishes known. Accordingly, he sent her numerous little cakes of maple sugar, besides giving her many knowing winks, his usual method of showing his preference. As she was one day strolling in the woods, she suddenly encountered Bill, who thought this was as favorable an opportunity as he would probably have. He was rather awkward and unaccustomed to love-making, but he resolved to do his best. Planting his foot upon a log, he with one hand drew from his head an old wool cap and thrust it under his arm, while with the other he twirled a huge brass rack key, which hung suspended from his pocket. He had the day before traded off an old jackknife, 2 puppies, and a cranked fiddle for a brass watch which would only go by shaking. Tiger, who had accompanied Fanny, eyed Bill's movements uneasily. He was, however, unnoticed by the young man, who had got his mouth open, and at last found courageous to say, "I always liked you, Fanny, 'cause you never laughed at me nor called me a fool, and now if you have me, you may carry my watch, and I'll work for your father 2 seasons in the hemp field." This last was wonderful, for Bill was notoriously lazy. Involuntarily Fanny laughed, but Bill construed it into approval, and was about to sit down by her when Tiger, with an angry growl, sprang forward and precipitated the ruined swain over the log into the dirt. Fanny called off the dog, and Bill gathered himself up, carefully brushing the dirt from his Sunday suit. Fearing he would repeat his offer, Fanny said, "I appreciate your kindness, Billy, but you see Tiger doesn't seem to approve of your proposal, and as I have great confidence in his judgment, I think I too must follow his example, and though I shan't knock you down, I shall have to tell you no." She might as well have knocked him down, for he instantly sat down, and covering his face with his hands, burst into such a fit of crying that Fanny, half laughing at and half pitying with him, said, "Poor Billy, I am sorry for you, and though I cannot marry you, I will like you just as well as you fancy I always have." This failed to quiet Billy, until Tiger made so many threatening demonstrations of anger that Billy thought it was wise to leave before he got another tumble. He had hardly disappeared when a loud voice called out, "Bravo, Tiger! You know how to fix 'em." Looking round, Fanny saw her father, who had been a silent spectator of the scene, and now came forward laughing heartily at his would-be son-in-law. "Pretty well done, Sunshine," said he. "Let's see how many offers does this make. There's Joe's 1, the doctor's 2, Yankee Cameron's 3, and lubbering Bill Jeffrey's 4th, and you're not quite 18. That'll do, that'll do." Afterward, when Mr. Middleton wished to entertain his visitors with anything extra, he would rehearse to them, with some exaggerations, Bill Jeffrey's proposal to Fanny. Glancing backward a few pages, we find we have omitted to repeat what happened among Dr. Lacey's blacks during the days when they were anxiously but vainly watching for the coming of their young master and his bride. For a week Aunt Dilsey was unusually crusty, and all her attempts at cooking invariably failed, plainly showing her mind to be in a disturbed state. "I don't care," she would say, "if the cake is all dough and the sauce all froth. They're good enough for her any day." Then she would call out, "Get along, you Jack, poking your fingers into a lass's cup. Make yourself scarce in this kitchen, or I'll crack your head mighty nigh as hard as the new miss will." Then she would scold Leffie, who, she said, was of no more account than a burnt stick. Now she was 'specting Rondeau. Pity but the old boat he come on wouldn't blow up and let 'em all into perdition together. Leffie knew her mother didn't mean more than half what she said, but she chose to keep silent, hoping each morning that the close of the day would bring the long-absent Rondeau. Thus, between scolding and fretting, cooking and sweating, Aunt Dilsey passed time until the day arrived on which, as she said, "they'd come if they ever did." Miss Lacey, whose husband had not yet received his son's letter announcing the catastrophe, came out to superintend affairs and receive her new daughter. In the large, handsome dining room, the supper table was neatly spread, while Aunt Daisy bustled about with the air of one who felt her time was short, but was determined to contest every inch of ground ere yielding it to another. She had condescended to put on her new calico gown, the one she proposed taking with her in a handkerchief, and had even washed the grease and molasses from Jack's and the baby's face, telling the former that he needn't mind about making up faces at the lady that night. Caleb had gone to the landing, and now Mrs. Lacey and the servants were gathered upon the upper piazza waiting his return. Suddenly Dilsey, whose eyesight seemed wonderfully sharpened, exclaimed, "There! That's Clabe! I could tell my old man if I should meet him at a camp meeting." Mrs. Lacey looked in the direction of the city and saw the carriage which Dilsey had pointed out. It proved to be Caleb, and Leffie, who was rather near-sighted, strained her eyes to see if Rondeau too was on the box. "There's nobody in that air," said Daisy. "Reckon the boat has run into the ground or burst her rigging. So, Leffie, you've put on your pink dress for nothing." The elder Mr. Lacey was, however, in the carriage, and alighting he advanced towards his wife and gave her the letter he had just received from his son. Mrs. Lacey read it, while the blacks crowded around Caleb, asking him scores of foolish questions, such as, "Was Master George in the boat? And why wasn't he there? And when would he be there?" When Mrs. Lacey finished reading the letter, she said to Leffie, who was still standing near, "Rondeau is well and will be home in a few days." "When's the new miss a-comin'?" asked Aunt Dilsey. "Not at all," was Mrs. Lacey's reply. "Glad on't," said Dilsey, "for now Jack can spit as fur and as big spits as he wants to." Nothing more was known by the blacks until many days after, when Rondeau returned home and related the whole story with many embellishments. He omitted to tell of the whipping which Ike had given him, but spoke with unqualified contempt of the old house and everything belonging to it, except Miss Fanny, who, he said, looked just like an angel, only a heap better. "You ought to have seen her," said he, "that night when everything was t'other side up. Folks a yelling like they was crazy, and one man was stark mad. Miss Julia lay on the floor, the blood pouring out of her eyes and mouth by pailfuls full. Miss Florence, she fainted, and they had to throw her out the window, glass and all, because there were so many low, ill-mannered niggers crowded in the hall." "I s'pose you's one of those niggers," said Aunt Dilsey. "Why, yes," returned Rondeau, "but then I was helping and was trying to push them all back so I could get to Master, who was feeling so bad that they sent for me because nobody else could comfort him." Here Rondeau began to fumble in his pocket, as if in search of something. Having found it, he continued, "Master got hold of her hand and grabbed off her wedding ring so quick that it broke her finger. Then he threw it from him, and I picked it up. Here it is," said he, holding up a ring. "That's a likely story," interrupted Aunt Dilsey. "If they wasn't married, how came the ring on her finger?" Rondeau saw he had stretched a trifle too much, but he answered, "Well, anyhow, he throwed it away, and I'm going to keep it till you know when, Dilsey." "Keep it till you're gray," said Aunt Dilsey. "Leffie ain't going to be married with no such flummery." Here Leffie, anxious to change the conversation, asked, "What of Miss Fanny?" "Why, yes," answered Rondeau, "that is what I'm going to tell. Right in the middle of the fuss I heard something moving softly down the stairs, and I saw a thing all as white as snow. Her hair, which was about the color of Leffie's neck, real handsome, was hanging in long curls down her back. I thought it was an angel, and Kinder touched her as she passed to see if she had wings, but the niggers said, 'It's Miss Fanny,' and next I heard 'twas all as still in the room, and Master was hugging and kissing her and crying over her. Then when I tried to get nearer and see more, they crowded me into such a little spot that I didn't breathe again for a week." "Why didn't you get out of the crowd then?" asked Dilsey. "How could I?" answered Rondeau. "Lord Dilsey, I'd like to have seen you there, but then there wouldn't have been room for anybody else, for the hall wouldn't more than hold you." Here the conversation ended, but for a long time Rondeau carried on his arm the marks of Aunt Dilsey's finger and thumb. End of chapter 22. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.
Chapter 23 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a Libravox recording. All Libravox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simão. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 23. Fanny's illness leads to her father's repentance. From the grassy hillside and bright green plains of Kentucky, the frosts of winter were gone. By the dancing brook and in the shady nooks of the quiet valleys, the warm spring sun had sought out and brought to life thousands of sweet wild blossoms, which in turn had faded away, giving place to the other flowers of a brighter and gayer hue. Each night from the upper balcony of her father's handsome dwelling, Fanny watched in vain for the coming of Dr. Lacey, whose promised return had long been delayed by the dangerous illness of his father. Over the wooded hills the breath of summer was floating, hot, arid, and laden with disease. Death was abroad in the land, and as each day exaggerated rumors of the havoc made by cholera in the sultry climate of Louisiana reached Fanny, fearful misgivings filled her mind lest Dr. Lacey, too, should fall a victim to the plague. For herself she had no fears, though slowly but surely through her veins the fever flame was creeping, scorching her blood, poisoning her breath, and burning her cheek, until her father, alarmed at her altered and languid appearance, inquired for the cause of the change. "Nothing but a slight headache," was the reply. Next to the cholera, Mr. Middleton most feared the typhoid fever, several cases of which had recently occurred in the neighborhood, and fearing lest the disease might be stealing upon his darling, he proposed calling the physician. But this Fanny would not suffer, and persisted in saying that she was well, until at last she lay all day upon the sofa, and Aunt Katy, when her favorite herb teas failed of effecting their wonted cure, shook her head, saying, "I knew it would be so. I always told you we couldn't keep her long." Dr. Gordon was finally called and pronounced her disease to be typhoid in its worst form. Days went by, and so rapid was the progress of the fever that Mr. Middleton trembled lest of him it had been decreed, "He shall be childless." To Fanny the thought of death was familiar. For her it had no terrors, and as her outward strength decayed, her faith in the eternal grew stronger and brighter. Yet she could not die without an assurance that again in the better world she would meet the father she so much loved. For her mother she had no fears, for during many years she had been a patient, self-denying Christian. At first Mr. Middleton listened in silence to Fanny's gentle words of entreaty, but when she spoke to him of her own death, and love which alone could sustain him then, he clasped her tightly to his heart, as if his arms alone could keep her there forever, saying, "Oh no, you must not tell me that. You will not die. Even now you are better." And the anxious father did try to deceive himself into the belief that Fanny was better, but when each morning's light revealed some fresh ravage the disease had made, when the flush on her cheeks grew deeper, and the light of her eye wilder and more startling, an agonized fear held the old man's heart in thrall. Many and many a weary night found him sleepless, as he wet his pillow with tears. Not such tears as he wept when Richard Wilmot died, nor such as fell upon the grave of his firstborn, for his grief then was not compared with what he now felt for his sunshine, his idol, his precious Fanny. "I cannot let her die," was the cry which hourly welled up from the depths of that fond father's aching heart. "Take everything I own, but leave me Sunshine. She mustn't die." Earnestly did Fanny pray that her father might be enabled better to bear its affliction. But he turned a deaf ear alike to her and this gentle, enduring wife, who, bowed with sorrow, yet sought to soothe her grief-stricken husband. Sadly he would turn away, saying, "It's no use talking. I can be pious if they take Fanny away. I can see why another one died. 'Twas to bring me to my senses, and show me how bad I use her. But Fanny, my sunshine, what has Josh done that she should leave him too? Oh, it's more than I can bear." At Dr. Gordon's request, a council of physicians in Frankfort was called. As the one who came last was about to enter a room, Mr. Middleton detained him while he said, "Save her, doctor, save her, and you shall have all I'm worth." Impatiently he awaited the decision. It came, but alas, it brought no hope. Mr. William Middleton, who had recently come from New Orleans, broke the news to his unhappy brother. Terrible was the anguish of Uncle Joshua when he became convinced that he must lose her. Nothing could induce him to leave her room, and, as if endowed with superhuman strength, he watched by her constantly, only leaving her once each day to visit the quiet grave, the bed of his own daughter, where now the long green grass was waving, and summer flowers were blooming, flowers which Fanny's hand had planted and the father's tears had watered. One night they were alone, the old man and his child. For several hours Fanny had turned uneasily upon her pillow, but she at last fell into a deep sleep. For a time her father sat quietly, listening to the sounds of her breathing. Then arising, he softly drew aside the curtains and looked long and anxiously at her as she slept. Suddenly, lifting his hands, he exclaimed, "Oh God, save her, or help me to bear it if she dies." It was the first prayer which for long, long years had passed his lips, but it had a power to bring back the olden feeling. When a happy boy, he had knelt at his mother's side, and was not ashamed to pray. Falling on his knees, he tried to recall the words of prayer his mother had taught him, but one petition alone came from his heart in that dark midnight hour. "Oh, don't let Fanny die, don't let her die, for who will comfort old Joshua when she is gone?" "The Savior, he who once wept at the grave of Lazarus, will be more to you than I ever was or ever can be," said Fanny. In her sleep she dreamed that her father prayed. She woke and found it true. "Come nearer to me, father," said she. He did so, and then among his thick gray locks she lay her thin white hand and prayed. It was a beautiful sight, and methinks the angels hovered round that young disciple, apparently so near the portals of heaven, sought to lead her weeping father to the same glad world. Her words were soothing, and where his darkened mind a ray of light seemed feebly, faintly shining. Before the morning dawned, he had resolved that if there still was hope for him, he would find it. Many a time during the succeeding days he prayed in secret, not that Fanny might be spared, but that he might be reconciled to God. His prayer at length was answered, and Uncle Joshua was a changed man. He showed it in everything, in the expression of his face and in the words he uttered. For his sunshine he still wept, but with a chastened grief, for now he knew that if she died he would see her in heaven. Where now was Dr. Lacey? Knew he not of the threatened danger? At his father's bedside, where for many days his place had been, he had received from Mr. William Middleton a letter announcing Fanny's illness, which, however, was not then considered dangerous. On learning the contents of the letter, the elder Mr. Lacey said, turning to his son, Go, George, go. I would not keep you from her a moment." The doctor needed no second bidding, and the first steamer which left New Orleans bore him upon its deck, anxious and impatient. Fast the days rolled on, and then who watched Fanny alternately hoped and feared, as she one day seemed better and the next worse. Of those days we will not speak. We hastened to a night 3 weeks from the commencement of her illness, when gathered in the room were anxious friends, who feared the next day's sun would see her dead. Florence, Kate, and Mrs. Miller were there, with tearful eyes and saddened faces. Frank Cameron, too, was there. Business, either real or fancied, had again taken him to Kentucky, and hearing of Fanny's illness, he had hastened to her. She had requested to be raised up, and now, leaning against her Uncle William, she lay in a deep slumber. In a corner of the room sat Uncle Joshua, his head bowed down, his face covered by his hands, while the large tears fell upon the carpeting, as he sadly whispered, "It will be lonesome at night. It will be lonesome in the morning. It will be lonesome everywhere." Florence stood by him and tried by gently smoothing his tangled hair to express the sympathy she could not speak. Suddenly there was the sound of fast-coming wheels, and Kate, thinking it must be Dr. Gordon, whom they were each moment expecting, ran out to meet him. Nearer and nearer came the carriage, and as Kate was peering through the darkness to see if it were the expected physician, Dr. Lacey sprang quickly to her side. In Frankfort he had heard that Fanny could not live, and now he eagerly asked, "Tell me, Mrs. Filler, is she yet alive?" Kate replied by leading him directly toward the sick chamber. As he entered the room, Uncle Joshua burst into a flash flood of tears, saying as he took the doctor's offered hand, "Poor boy, poor George, you're losing a great deal, but not as much as I, for you can find another Fanny, but for me, there's no more sunshine when they carry her away." Dr. Gordon now came, and after feeling her pulse and listening to the sound of her breathing, he said, "When she wakes from this sleep, I think tomorrow will be decided. She'll be better or worse." And he was right. Although the old clock in the hall told the hour of midnight, here she roused from the deep slumber which had seemed so much like the long-lasting sleep of death. Her first words were for "Water, water." As she put her hand to take the offered glass, Dr. Gordon whispered to Dr. Lacey, "She is better, but must not see you tonight." In a twinkling, Mr. Middleton's large hand was laid on Dr. Lacey's shoulder, and hurrying him to the adjoining room, he said, "Stay here till morning, and neither breath nor stir." Dr. Lacey complied with the request as far as it was possible, though never seemed a night so long, and never dawned a morning so bright as did the succeeding one, when through the house the joyous tidings ran that the crisis was past, and Fanny would live. In the course of the morning, Fanny asked Kate, who alone was attending her, if Dr. Lacey was not there. "What makes you think so?" asked Kate. "Because," answered Fanny, "I either heard him or dreamed that I did." "And if he's here, could you bear to see him now?" "Oh, yes, yes," was the eager answer, and the next moment Dr. Lacey was by her side. Intuitively, Kate left the room. Consequently, we have no means of knowing what occurred during that interview, when Dr. Lacey, as it were, received back from the arms of death his Fanny, whose recovery from that time was sure though slow. Mr. Middleton, in the exuberance of his joy at having his sunshine restored, seemed hardly sane, but frequently kept muttering to himself, "Yes, yes, I remember. I'll do it. Only give me a little time." At the same time his elbow moved impatiently, as if nudging off some unseen visitor. What it was that he remembered and would do was not known for several days, and then he informed his wife that when at first he feared that Fanny should not live, He had racked his brain to know why these fresh evils brought upon him, and had concluded that it was partly to punish him for his ill treatment of Julia when living, and partly because that, now she was dead, he had neglected to purchase for her any gravestones. "And I promised," said he, "that if she was spared, I'd buy as nice a gravestone as I would if it was Sunshine." 3 weeks from that time there stood by the mound in the little graveyard a plain, handsome monument, on which was simply inscribed, "Julia, aged 20." One after another, those who had been with Fanny during her illness departed to their homes. Frank Hammer lingered several weeks in Frankfurt. Florence, too, was there with some relatives. Now, reader, if you value our friendship, you will not accuse him of being fickle. He had loved Fanny long and faithfully, but he knew the time was coming when he would see her the wife of another. What wonder was it, then, if he suffered his eyes occasionally to rest admiringly upon Florence Woodburn's happy face, or that he frequently found himself trying to trace some resemblance between the dark hazel of Florence's eyes and the deep blue of Fanny's. With woman's quick perception, Florence divined Frank's thoughts, and although she professed herself to be terribly afraid of his Presbyterian smile and deaconish ways, she took good care not to discourage him. But she teased him unmercifully, and played him many sorry tricks. He bore it all good-humoredly, and when he started for New York, he had with him a tiny casing, from which peeped the merry face of Florence, looking as if just meditating some fresh mischief. And what of Florence? Why, safely stowed away at the bottom of her bureau drawer, under a promiscuous pile of gloves, ribbons, laces, and handkerchiefs, was a big daguerreotype. But as Florence guarded the drawer most carefully, always keeping the key in her pocket, we are unable to say anything certain upon the subject. Up to this day we don't know exactly whose face it was that led Florence to the drawer so many times a day, but we are safe in saying that it looked frank enough to be Frank himself. Here for a time we leave her, and return to Mr. Middleton's, where Fanny was improving each day. Dr. Lacey watched her recovery anxiously, fearing continually lest some new calamity should happen to take his treasure from him. Owing to the protracted illness of his father, it became necessary that he should go back to New Orleans, but as soon as possible he would return, and then— Fanny could have told you what then, and so, too, could we, but we prefer keeping you in suspense. End of Chapter 23. Recording by Simão from Portugal. Chapter 24 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simão. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 24. The Wedding. The autumn months were gone. December had come, and Christmas was coming. The negroes far and near had counted the days which must pass before their expected holidays. In Uncle Joshua's kitchen there was much talking and laughing, fixing and fussing, and some crying. Had you asked the cause of the crying, you would have been told that Miss Fanny was to be married Christmas Eve, and the week following she would leave them and start for New Orleans. Preparations commenced on a large scale, for Uncle Joshua, a little proud, it may be, of his handsome house, had determined on a large party. The old gentleman even went so far as to order for himself a new suit of broadcloth, saying by way of apology that, though the jeans coat and bagging pants did well enough for Josh, they wouldn't answer nohow for the father of Mrs. Dr. George Lacey. A week before the wedding, Florence, who loved dearly to be in a bustle, came laden with bandboxes and carpet bags. Hourly through the house rang her merry laugh, as she flitted hither and thither, actually doing nothing in her zeal to do everything. She had consented to be bridesmaid, on condition that she should choose her own groomsman, who she said should be Uncle Billy, as she always called Mr. William Middleton, unless Providence sent her someone she liked better. Whether it were owing to Providence or to an invitation which went from Florence to New York, we are unable to say, but 2 days before the 24th, Uncle Joshua surprised Florence and Fanny by opening the door of the room where they were sitting and saying, "Oh, my boy, here they come. Come on." The girls started up, and in a moment Frank stood between them, with an arm thrown around each. "Why, Mr. Cameron," said Florence, "what did you come for, and who knew you were coming?" "I came to see you, and you knew I was coming," answered Frank. "Well, then," returned Florence, "if you came to see me, do look at me, and not keep your eyes fixed so continually on Fanny. In a few days you will be breaking the commandment which says, 'Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife.'" "Possibly I might, had I never seen you," answered Frank. At a late hour that night Florence moved with soft footsteps about her sleeping room, fearing lest she should awaken Fanny. Her precautions were useless, for Fanny was awake. Looking at Florence, she said, "Oh, Florrie, you naughty girl, what makes you blush so dreadfully?" The next half hour was spent by Florence in telling Fanny what Frank had just asked her in 4 or 5 words, which she had answered in one, viz., if she would be his wife. "But then," said Florence, pretending to pout, "he was so conscientious that he had to tell me what I already knew, which was that he once loved you better than he should ever love another." Frank had asked Florence to share his lot through life, and she, like any other good, prompt Kentucky girl, had readily answered yes, although she was frightened next moment for fear she had been too easy won by the cold Yankee, as she called him, and she proposed taking back what she said just for the sake of being teased. Mr. Woodburn came next day to bring Florence some article of dress, which she would need. He was not surprised when Frank, taking him aside, modestly asked for his daughter. He said yes, almost as readily as Florence had done, and then it was hard telling which seemed most happy, Frank or Dr. Lacey. The 24th of December came at last. We at the North who, during 6 months of the year, blow our benumbed fingers, can scarcely imagine how bright and beautiful are some of the clear warm days of a Kentucky winter. On this occasion, as if nature had resolved to do her best, the day was soft and sunny as in early autumn, presenting a striking contrast to the wild, angry storm which rent the sky when once more neath Uncle Joshua's roof a bridal party was assembled. As night approached, carriage after carriage rolled up the long, gravelled pathway, until Ike declared, "There was no more room in the barns, and if any more came he'd have to drive them into the kitchen." Up and down the broad stairway tripped light and joyous footsteps, until the rooms above, which Luce had put in so exact order, presented a scene of complete confusion. Bandboxes were turned bottom side up, and their contents indiscriminately scattered until it was impossible to tell what was yours and what wasn't. At length, through the parlor door came Dr. Lacey and Fanny, followed by Frank Cameron and Florence. Throughout the rooms was a solemn hush as Fanny was made Dr. Lacey's wife. Firmly Dr. Lacey held her hand until the last word was spoken. Then, when he felt sure that she was his, he stooped down and whispered in her ear, "Thank God that you are mine at last." 3 days after the wedding, Mr. Middleton's carriage again stood before the door. When all was ready, Uncle Joshua knelt down, and winding his arm around Fanny, prayed in simple, touching language that God would protect his sunshine, and at last bring them all to the same home. "All of us, and don't let one be missing there." There was a peculiar pathos in the tone of his voice as he said the last words, and all knew to whom he referred. Long and wearisome at Mr. Middleton's were the days succeeding Fanny's departure, while in Dr. Lacey's home all was joy and gladness. It was about dark when Dr. Lacey arrived. Happy as a bird, Fanny sprang up the steps. Everything about her screamed homelike and cheerful. Kind, dusky faces peered at her from every corner, while Aunt Dilsey, with a complacent smile, stood ready to receive her. Fanny was prepared to like everything, but there was something peculiarly pleasing to her in Aunt Dilsey's broad, good-humored face. Going up to her, she took both her hands and said, "I know we shall be good friends. I shall like you, and you shall love me a little, won't you? Just as the old aunties did I left in Kentucky." Aunt Dilsey hadn't expected all this, and the poor creature burst into tears, saying, "Lord bless the sweet miss, I'd die for her this minute, I would." Rondeau, Lacey, and the other blacks belonging to the establishment now came forward, and in the crowd little Jack's bow was entirely unappreciated. But Fanny next day made demands by giving him nearly a pound of candy, which had left the effect of making him sick a week, but he got well in time to be present at Leffie's wedding, which took place just a week after Dr. Lacey's return. Leffie, who chanced to be just the size of her young mistress, was thrown into ecstasies by the gift of a thin pink and white silk dress, which Fanny presented to her for a bridal gown. Aunt Dilsey, in order to show her thanks, went down on her knees, a thing she never attempted again, as it took her such an unheard-of length of time to recover a standing posture. Dr. Lacey had made Leffie the present of a pair of gold earrings, so that she was really a pretty bride, and Rondeau was the happiest negro in all New Orleans. As weddings seem to be the order of this chapter, we may here, as well as anywhere, dispose of Mrs. Carrington, whom, you will remember, Raymond said he would one day marry. When he left Frankfort, he had no definite idea as to what he should do, but after reaching Cincinnati, it occurred to him that his mother had a wealthy old bachelor uncle living in St. Louis, and thither he was determined to go. This uncle, Mr. Dunlap, received the young man cordially, for he was the first relative he had met with in years. There was something, too, in the manner with which Raymond introduced himself that won for him a place in the crusty old man's good opinion. "I'm Fred Raymond," said he, "your niece Ellen's son, and as poor a Jack as there is this side of California. They say you are a stingy old customer, but I don't care for that. You have got to give me some business, and a home, too." Raymond's method of approaching the old gentleman was successful, and he at once gave him a good position, which later developed into a partnership. Feeling himself established and finding Mrs. Carrington in St. Louis, Raymond pressed his suit, and they were eventually married. The couple were disappointed in their expectations of a fortune, for within 2 years after the marriage, Mr. Dunlap suddenly died. He had intended to make his will and make Raymond his heir, but like many other men, he put it off until it was too late, and this property, which was found to be less than supposed, went back to his brothers and sisters, and from then to their children and grandchildren, so that Raymond got but a small share. He, however, retained his position as a merchant, and struggled hard to keep his wife in the same circumstances to which she had been accustomed. She appreciated his kindness, and when at the end of 3 years she was the mother of 3 children, she concluded it was time to lay aside all desire for fashionable amusements, and she became a tolerably affectionate wife and a wonderfully indulgent mother. End of chapter 24. Recording by Ana Simão from Portugal.
Chapter 25 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. The Wanderer. In Uncle Joshua's home there were sad, troubled faces and anxious hearts, as the husband and daughter watched by the wife and mother, whose life on earth was well nigh ended. For her mother's family, Mrs. Middleton, had inherited the seeds of consumption which had fastened upon her. Day by day they watched her, and when at last she left them, it seemed so much like falling away to sleep that Mr. Middleton, who sat by her, knew not the exact moment which made him a lonely widower. The next afternoon, sympathizing friends and neighbors assembled to pay the last tribute of respect to Mrs. Middleton, and many an eye overflowed, and more than one heart ached, as the gray-haired old man bent sadly above the coffin which contained the wife of his early love. But he mourned not as one without hope, for her end had been peaceful, and when upon her face his tears fell, he felt assured that again beyond the dark river of death he should meet her. The night succeeding the burial, Mr. Middleton's family, overcome with fatigue and grief, retired early to their rooms. But Fanny could not sleep. Between 10 and 11, she arose and, throwing on her dressing gown, nervously walked up and down her sleeping room. It was a little over a year after her marriage. Through the closed shutters the rays of a bright September moon were stealing, and attracted by the beauty of the night, Fanny opened the blinds, and the room was filled with a flood of soft, pale light. From the window where she stood, she could distinguish the little graveyard, with its cypress and willow trees, and its white monument gleaming through the silvery moonlight. And near that monument was a dark spot, the grave of her beloved mother. If all nights were as lovely as this, thought she, it would not seem half so dreary to sleep in the cold, dark grave. And then Fanny fell into a fit of musing of the night that would surely come when she would first be left alone in the shadowy graveyard. In the midst of her reverie, her attention was attracted by a slight female figure, which from some quarters had approached unperceived, and now, upon the newly made grave, was bowing itself in apparent weeping. The size and form of the girl were so much like Lucy that Fanny concluded it must be she, at the same time wondering how, with her superstitious ideas, she ventured alone near a grave in the night time. In a moment, however, she saw that Tiger, the watchdog, was with her, and at the same instant the sound of a suppressed sob fell on her ear. "Poor Lucy," she said. "I do not think she loved my mother so well, and I will go to her and mingle my tears with her." In a short time Fanny was in the open air, and on her way to the graveyard. As she approached her mother's grave, she said gently, "Lucy, Lucy, why are you out so late?" The person addressed partially raised her head and answered hurriedly, "Oh, Fanny, Fanny, do not be frightened and leave me. I am not dead, and never was buried in that grave, as you suppose, but I'm here tonight, a living, repentant woman." And throwing back her bonnet, the thin, white face of Julia Middleton was in the bright moonlight, perfectly distinguishable to Fanny, who at first recoiled in fear and leaned for support against the marble pillar near which she was standing. She, however, soon recovered her self-command, and glancing at the object on the grave, saw that she was caressing Tiger, who seemed trying various ways to evince his joy at finding one whom he had long missed, for he had always been Julia's favorite. Their fiery natures accorded well. Again Julia spoke. "Fanny, dear Fanny, in an adjoining state I heard of mother's illness and hastened to see her, but I'm too late, and now do not think me a phantom, for see, Tiger recognizes me and welcomes me home, and will not you?" An instant Fanny wavered. Then with a half fearful, half joyful cry she went forward, and by the grave of her mother that day lowered into the dust, the sisters met in a long, fervent embrace. Into the best chamber of their father's house Fanny led the weeping, repentant girl, and gently removed her bonnet and shawl. bade her lie down on the nicely cushioned lounge while she went for her father. As she was leaving the room, Julia rose and laid her small, bony hand on Fanny's shoulder. It had rested there before, for in the graveyard, with their buried mother between them, Julia's arms had encircled her sister's neck. But the first excitement was over, and now, involuntarily, Fanny shrank from that touch. For in spite of all her courage, she could not help associating Julia with the grass-grown grave and the large white monument. "What is it, Julia?" she said calmly. "Do you wish to see father?" "Oh, yes, yes," answered Julia. "But not him, the other one, at least not tonight. You understand." "I do," said Fanny, and she glided down the stairs toward her father's room. He was awake, for ere her hand touched the doorknob, his sonorous voice rang out. "Who's thar?" fell on her ears. This somewhat disconcerted her, for she had intended stopping near his door to devise the best means by which to break the intelligence. But "who's thar?" was again repeated, and entering the room she said softly, "It is I, father." "Why, sure enough," said he. And then, as the light from her lamp fell on her features, he exclaimed, "Why, how white you be! What's the matter? Who's upstairs? Is George sick?" "No, George is not sick," said Fanny, but then, as well as she could, she told him all she knew. Uncle Joshua's nervous system was unstrung, and his physical health impaired by long nights of watching with his wife, and now, when this fresh shock came upon him, he fell back half fainting upon his pillow. Then, rousing himself, he said, "Alive and come back! I don't deserve this. But where is she? I will go to her." Fanny directed him where to find her, and then returned to Julia, whither her father soon followed. Uncle Joshua was not prepared for the change in his daughter. He did not even think of her as he saw her last, wasted by sickness. But in his imagination he beheld her as she was in her days of health and dazzling beauty, when with diabolical cunning she had brought Dr. Lacey to her feet. Now, however, her face was thin, white, and haggard, for such a life as she had lived had never conduced to the beauty and health of anyone. Her eyes, sunken in their sockets and swollen with recent weeping, looked frightfully large and wild, and to complete the metamorphosis, her beautiful glossy hair was now cut short on her neck and pushed far back from her brow, across which lay more than one premature wrinkle. The sight of her for a time unsettled the old man's reason. Taking her in his arms, he alternately cried and laughed over her, saying, "I knew you'd come back. I expected and I waited for you." Julia's altered appearance troubled him, and drawing her head down upon his bosom, and laying his hand on her thin white face, he said, "Poor child, what has changed you? Where have you been, and who did I buy that big stone for if it wasn't for you?" "Not tonight, dear father," answered Julia. "Let me rest tonight, and tomorrow I will tell you all." End of The Wanderer. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gaghan.
Chapter 26 of Tempest and Sunshine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 26. Julia at Home Again. Overcome with fatigue and excitement, Julia, immediately after her father left her on the preceding night, had fallen into a deep sleep which was unbroken till long after dawn. Then she was aroused by her father calling up the negroes. Hastily starting up, she looked around her, and for a moment strove to remember what had happened. Soon she remembered all, and burying her face in the pillows, she sobbed out, "Father, I thank thee. The prodigal is at last at home." Hastily arising, she proceeded with her toilet, which was nearly completed when Fanny tapped gently at the door, and immediately entered the room, saying, "Good morning, dear Julia. I am so glad you really are here, and that it is not a dream. But come, breakfast is waiting, and so is father, and so is George." "Oh, I can't see him, I can't," said Julia, and Fanny answered, "Oh, never mind him. I've told him all about it, and he is ready to receive you as a sister." So saying, she led the reluctant girl down the long staircase, through the wide hall to the door of the breakfast room, where Mr. Middleton stood waiting for them. His tones and manner were very affectionate as he kissed the wanderer, and said, "I am so glad you are here." Julia could have wept, but she would not. There was yet another to meet, and choking down her tears she nerved herself for the trial. Of what occurred next she knew nothing, until her cold white hand was clasped by another so warm, so life-giving in its touch, that she raised her eyes and met the calm, quiet gaze of Dr. Lacey. Neither of them spoke until Julia, averting her eyes, said, "Am I forgiven?" "You are," was the answer, and then Uncle Joshua exclaimed, "Thar, that'll do. Now come to your breakfast, children, for I'm mighty hungry and shan't wait another minute." After breakfast Julia was greatly surprised at seeing her father take from the bookcase the old family Bible, on whose dark dusty covers she remembered having many a time written her name. All was now explained. Her father's gentleness of look and manner were accounted for, and as for the first time in her life she knelt by his side and heard him as he prayed, her heart swelled with emotion, and she longed to tell him, though she dared not hope she was a Christian, she was still trying to lead a different, a better life. That afternoon in her chamber were seated Mr. Middleton and Fanny, while Julia recounted the story of her wanderings. "The idea of leaving my home," she said, "was not a sudden impulse, else had I returned sooner, but it was the result of long, bitter reflection. In the first days of my humiliation I wished that I might die, for though the thought of death and the dread hereafter made me tremble, it was preferable to the scorn and contempt I should necessarily meet if I survived. Then came a reaction, and when our angel mother glided so noiselessly around my sick room, when you, darling Fanny, nursed me with so much care, and even father's voice grew low and kind as he addressed me, my better nature, if I had any, was touched, and I thought I would like to live for the sake of retrieving the past. But the evil spirit which has haunted me from infancy whispered that as soon as I was well all would be changed. You, Fanny, would hate me, and father would treat me as he always had, only worse. Poor dear child! I didn't ought to do so, I know," said Uncle Joshua, and Julia continued. "Then I thought how the world would loathe, and despise, and point at me, until I was almost maddened, and when Dr. Gordon said I would live, the tempter whispered suicide. But I dared not do that. About that time I heard rumors of a marriage which would take place as soon as I was well. And Fanny, will you forgive me? I tried to be sick as long as possible for the sake of delaying your happiness." A pressure of the hand was Fanny's only answer, and Julia proceeded, "I could not see you married to him. I could not meet the world and its censure, so I determined to go away. I had $30 in my purse, of which no one knew, and taking that I started, I knew not where. On reaching the schoolhouse, something impelled me to enter it, and I found there a young girl about my own size. Under other circumstances I might have been frightened, but now, utterly fearless, I addressed her, and found from her answers that she was crazy. A sudden idea entered my brain. I would change clothes with her, and thus avoid discovery. She willingly acceded to my proposition, and in my new attire I again started toward Lexington, which I reached about 4 in the morning. I had no definite idea as to where I wanted to go, but the sight of the Cincinnati stage drawn up before the Phoenix determined me. I had purposely kept my own bonnet and veil, as the maniac girl wore neither. Drawing the latter over my face, I kept it there while securing my place in the coach, and until we were many miles from the city. Passengers entered and left, and some looked inquisitively at me in my slightly fantastic dress. We reached Cincinnati about 10 in the morning, and with a long, glad breath I stepped from the coach, and felt that Kentucky and my notorious character were behind. I stopped at the hotel, and the next 2 days were spent in procuring myself a decent outfit. Each night I went to a different house, for the sake of avoiding suspicion, and as my bills were promptly paid, no questions were ever asked. At the D house I saw in a paper an advertisement for a teacher in a school in one of the interior towns. I had formed some such plan for the future, and instantly determined personally to apply for the situation. I did so, but credentials were required, and I had none to give. Somewhat weary of my adventure, I returned to Cincinnati, and in passing through one of the streets, my eye caught the sign "Fashionable Dressmaking and Millinery." I knew I had a taste for that, and I concluded to offer myself as an apprentice. Then she told how she had toiled on day after day with dim eye and aching head for over a year, in the unwholesome atmosphere of a crowded workshop, conducted by a slave-driving, inconsiderate woman named Miss Dillon, while thoughts of home and remorse for the past preyed on her heart. "But why did you not come back?" asked Fanny. "We would have received you most gladly." "I felt that I could not do that," said Julia. "I knew that you thought me dead, and I fancied that father, at least, would feel relieved." "Oh, child," groaned Uncle Joshua, "don't say so. I was mighty mean, I know, but I never got to that." After a moment Julia told them that she had had to deliver a party dress to Florence Woodburn at Mr. Graham's house one evening, and while waiting in the hall, had heard Florence read a letter from Nellie Stanton aloud to Alice Graham. In the letter, Nellie said that Mrs. Middleton was not expected to live, and that Dr. Lacey and Fanny from New Orleans were with her. This news caused her to resign her position at Miss Dillon's and hurry home. "I reached Lexington," she said, "about 9 o'clock in the evening, and as I thought my baggage might incommode me, I purposely left it there, but hired a boy to bring me home. When we reached the gate at the entrance of the woods, I told him he could return, as I preferred going the remainder of the way alone. He seemed surprised, but complied with my request. I had never heard of the new house, and as I drew near I was puzzled, and fancied I was wrong. But Tiger bounded forward, at first angrily, then joyfully, and I knew I was right. All about the house was so dark, so still, that a dreadful foreboding filled my heart, a fear that mother might be dead. I remembered the little graveyard and instantly bent my steps thither. I saw the costly marble and the carefully kept grave, and a thrill of joy ran through my veins, for they told me I was kindly remembered in the home I had so darkened. But another object riveted my attention. It was a fresh mound, and I knew full well who rested there. Never have I shed such tears of anguish as fell upon the sod which covers my sainted mother. In the intensity of my grief, I was not conscious of Fanny's approach until she stood near me. The rest you know. And now, father, will you receive to your home and affection one who has so widely strayed?" "Willingly, most willingly," said Uncle Joshua, as he folded her to his bosom. "And if I had done as I ought to, a heap of this wouldn't have happened. Oh, I didn't ought to do so, I didn't, and I ain't going to any more. You shall live with me when Sunshine's gone, and we would be so happy if your poor mother could only see us and know it all." From that time nothing could exceed Uncle Joshua's kindness to his daughter. He seemed indeed trying to make up for the past, and frequently he would whisper to himself, "No, I didn't ought to do so. I see more and more that I didn't." Still his fondness for Fanny was undiminished, and occasionally, after looking earnestly at both his children, he would exclaim, "Hang me if I don't believe Sunshine is a heap the handsomest." But if these words caused Julia any emotion, 'twas never betrayed. From Julia's story there could be no doubt that the maniac girl was laid in the grave which Uncle Joshua had thought belonged to his daughter. No tidings of her had been heard, although one gentleman thought that he once had met with a girl answering to her description in the stage-coach between Lexington and Cincinnati. All search in that quarter was unavailing, and over her fate a dark mystery lay, until Julia suddenly appeared and threw light on the matter. The afflicted father, for she had no mother, was sent for, and when told where his child was laid, asked permission to have her disinterred and taken to his family burial place. His request was granted, the grave was opened, and then refilled and leveled with the earth. The monument Julia took care to have carefully preserved as a memento of the olden time. As will be supposed, Julia's return furnished the neighborhood and surrounding country with a topic of conversation for many weeks. At first nearly all treated her with cool neglect, but as she kept entirely at home, curiosity to see one who had, as it were, come back from the dead, triumphed over all other things, and at last all who came to see Fanny asked also for her sister. Among the few who at once hastened to give the penitent girl the hand of friendship was Kate Miller, and as she marked her gentle manner and the subdued glance of her still somewhat haughty eyes, she wound her arm about her neck and whispered, "I shall in time learn to love you dearly for the sake of more than one." Julia comprehended her, or thought she did, and answered, "Oh, Mrs. Miller, that one dreadful crime has troubled me more than all the rest. I killed him, your noble brother, and from the moment I deliberately determined to do so I became leagued with the tempter, who lured me madly on. But I outdid myself, and was entangled in the snare my own hands had laid." "It is ever so," answered Kate. "Our most secret sins will in the end find us out." The reader is perhaps anxious to know whether back across the Atlantic Ashton brought his Spanish bride. Yes, he did. Mr. William Middleton accompanied him to the house of Sir Arthur Effingham, whom they found to be dying. His property was gone, and he feared that he must leave the youthful Inez to the cold charities of the world and a miserly brother. When Mr. Middleton made himself known, the dying man pointed to Inez and said, "You once loved the mother. Care for the daughter when I am gone, will you?" "I will," answered Mr. Middleton. on condition that you consent to having a young friend of mine share the care with me." At the same time he presented Ashton. Sir Arthur recognized him immediately, and answered, "Willingly, most willingly. I was a fool to spurn you once as I did." In a few hours Sir Arthur was dead, and Inez was an orphan. But her grief was soothed by the presence of Ashton, who, a few days before sailing for America, made her his wife. During the voyage Mr. Middleton informed Ashton that as soon as he reached home he intended making his will, by which he should bequeath his property to Inez. Said he, "I have spent so many years of my life in India that I find the climate of New Orleans more congenial to my feelings than a colder one would be. Consequently, I shall purchase a house in that city, and as I look upon you and Inez as my children, I shall insist upon your living with me if you have no objection." During the winter Fanny wrote frequently to her father urging him to visit her, but this he declined doing, and early the following May he stood one evening impatiently awaiting the arrival of Ike, who had gone to Frankfort with the expectation of meeting Fanny and her husband. Everything had been put in readiness. The parlors and best chamber were opened and aired. The carriage and carriage horses had been brushed up, a new saddle had been bought for Fanny's pony, and a new dress for each of the black women, and everything and everybody seemed expecting a joyful time. As the carriage approached the house, Uncle Joshua looked wistfully toward it, trying to catch a glimpse of Sunshine, whom he had not seen for nearly a year and a half. But only the face of a little negro girl was seen looking from the window, and Uncle Joshua exclaimed, "Now what's possessed them to fetch that yaller gal? I've got niggers enough to wait on 'em." But the yaller gal knew very well why she was there, and so ere long did Uncle Joshua. The steps were let down, and there, blithesome and gay as ever, Fanny sprang from the carriage and ran into the arms of her father, who kissed her again and again, holding her off to look at her, and then again drawing her to him and saying, "You're handsomer than ever." During this process the yellow girl, Rose, had brought from the carriage a mysterious-looking bundle of flannel and white cambric, which now in Dr. Lacey's arms was crowing with delight as its little nurse bobbed up and down, making at it all sorts of grimaces. "What the No, I forgot, I didn't mean so. But what is that?" said Uncle Joshua, releasing Fanny and advancing toward Dr. Lacey, who proudly placed in his arms a beautiful 9-month-old baby, saying, "We have brought you a second Sunshine." End of chapter 26. Recording by Amanda Friday. End of Tempest and Sunshine by Mary Jane Holmes.